Religions are always changing, and that's led to some pretty huge misunderstandings over the years. In fact, you've probably even believed some of these common false facts about ancient religions. Holy misconceptions, Batman! Priests were never married. Everybody knows that Catholic priests can't marry. They forego such earthly pleasures because of their devotion to God.
You see, falling for money, it's my only vice.
Here's your drink.
Oh, thanks, sugar.
At least, that's how it's been lately. There was a time when priests were as free as anyone to be husbands. In the early AD days, priests still knew the bliss of endless compromise and physical pleasure with a spouse. That started to change in 306 when the subject of clergy marriage was raised. It was still allowed, but the church began pushing for chastity among its religious representatives. The last legs of a priest's wedding march were kicked out in the 11th century as part of the Gregorian reforms. Priests who could not live celibate lives were seen as lacking moral authority. The church was growing and wanted to shore up its authority as a moral leader. According to some scholars, this even helped make the case for the Crusades, which were not exactly a high point in morality. Hell always existed. Believe it or not, that fiery pit of eternal torment where Grandma condemned you for sneaking that cookie hasn't always been part of religious canon. Truth is, faith took a while to heat up. The Old Testament contains the story of creation, the first humans, the first murder, and horrendous acts of violence, but no hell. Theologian Thomas B. Thayer explained in 1855 that, in the beginning, there was Sheol, a place for the dead. It's a place for shame or depression, but not a real afterlife. Think of it like Ron Burgundy's phone booth.
I'm in a glass case of emotion!
The fires of hell were actually lit in Gehenna, a valley in Israel where executed criminals were left to burn. According to Christian author William West's research, this was, quote, the severest judgment which a Jewish court could pass upon a criminal. A place of punishment, never-ending fire, and the dead burning? Now that's much more like what Granny had in mind.
Hey, watch where you step at!
Oh, sorry.
Centuries later, the New Testament unveiled the idea of a multiple-choice afterlife, and hell as we know it finally showed up. Buddhism hates violence. The most famous example of a Buddhist is probably the Dalai Lama, the perfect encapsulation of Buddhism's peaceful tenets. The guy even has a sense of humor.
No, you can't reincarnate the demon into me.
Yes.
What's not to love? Well, for all that talk about peace, the wages of karma actually offer some wiggle room on the value of a life. As historian Peter Harvey explains, there are texts that allow for murder, even stories of the Buddha taking one life to spare others. According to one Buddhist saying, killing one in order to warn 100 is not a violation of the precept of non-killing. It is a meritorious action to save the lives of human beings. There's no one path to nirvana, and in some cases, even holy men will fight to get there. Religions enjoy images of faith. If you look around, there's no shortage of religious icons in the world, from Renaissance artwork to stained glass windows, right up to Yeezy's Jesus piece. God even does commercials. But back in the day, depicting the face of God was considered sinful and forbidden.
Bingo! Yahtzee! Is that your final answer? Our survey says God! Bing, 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 bing.
The Abrahamic faiths didn't advertise. The fear was these images broke the second commandment, which prohibited making graven images to worship. According to the Catholic Encyclopedia, this was thought to be too close to how pagans worship. Virtue aside, there was a practical reason: money. As Jeffrey Spear explains in his book Picturing the Bible, the early Christian community was just too poor to pay someone to paint the pictures. Judaism and Islam still keep away from images today. You might think that Islam forbids depicting the face of Allah or Muhammad, but it's a little more complicated than that. The easy way to say it is it depends on the sect, but it's in best practice to not show Muhammad's image ever. Practitioners of Judaism prefer to write G-D for fear of having to ever erase his name. Catholics were debating the issue even up until 1866, until they decided that artistic interpretations of the scriptures could help spread the word and deepen understanding. Saints are all great. The word saint conjures the idea of a good person, someone who gives their last dollar to someone less fortunate and is capable of incredible holy things. But you can't just sprout wings and shoot off to heaven. There are actual rules to becoming a saint, and it can take a few centuries to be canonized. Those centuries must help because, looking back, man, those saints were into some weird stuff. It's common in the lives of saints to find hardcore fasting, the faithful pushing themselves to the limits of physical endurance and extreme penance. Then there's Saint Macarius the Younger. The Lives of the Saints tells us that he mastered starvation in the desert. Then he accidentally killed a gnat and was so mortified that he ran to a swamp where he lived naked for 6 months at the mercy of stinging insects until his whole body was disfigured by them. If body horror isn't your cup of tea, meet Saint Simeon Stylites the Elder. New Advent has compiled his path to sainthood. He stood on a series of columns, each higher than the last, getting food from his followers for 36 years.
He's good. With my help, he could be the best.
The X-Men are one of Marvel's most enduring franchises. From famous mainstays like Wolverine and Storm to more out-there characters, they've starred in endless movies and comics. But with all that material, there are a lot of lies. Here are things you might get wrong about the X-Men. More casual readers might look at a team of heroes gathered together by a guy who calls himself Professor X and assume that Charles Xavier named his team after himself. In the pages of their very first adventure, however, Xavier mentions that the X-Men are named for having extra abilities, and while it's not very convincing, we'll just have to take his word for it. In real life, Stan Lee and Jack Kirby wanted to give their book a more straightforward title, The Mutants. When they presented the idea to Marvel publisher Martin Goodman, he liked the concept but not the name. He told Lee that readers weren't smart enough to know what a mutant was and requested a change.
This is the stupidest thing I've ever heard.
Looking back, it's pretty easy to give Goodman the credit for being right on this one, but we're left wondering about the same thing Lee did once he got the new title approved. Before that comic came out, nobody knew what the X-Men were either. Superpowered misfits who protected a society that hated and feared them. Abilities that often felt more like a curse than a superpower. Evil forces gathering against them in a group known as the Brotherhood. A mysterious leader in a wheelchair who would eventually be revealed to have more than his share of secrets. When the X-Men hit the stands in 1963, those elements ensured that readers had never seen anything like this before, unless they were reading DC Comics a few months earlier. Uncanny X-Men #1 debuted in September 1963. In June of that same year, however, Marvel's distinguished competition published My Greatest Adventure #80, introducing the world to a team called the Doom Patrol. Made up of outcasts from society, the Doom Patrol fought the strange crimes of the Brotherhood of Evil and were led by the Chief, a mastermind in a wheelchair who had gathered them all together. Sound familiar? While Arnold Drake and Bruno Premiani's Doom Patrol stories hit the shelves first, there's been a lot of debate over who was actually getting ripped off or whether it was all a coincidence, with Drake referring to Stan Lee as an idea thief in interviews. Despite their early similarities, however, the two teams would take some wildly divergent paths as they continued, and unfortunately for the Doom Patrol, the X-Men would absolutely become the more popular version of that idea.
We are the future, Charles, not them.
The X-Men are the kind of massive franchise that broke sales records with over 6 million copies sold when the second X-Men title was launched in 1991. As hard as it might be to believe, though, that wasn't always the case. When the Uncanny X-Men debuted, Marvel Comics was riding high on the success of a string of hits that started with Fantastic Four and continued with Spider-Man, but not everything worked out so well. Even Stan Lee and Jack Kirby's first attempt at The Incredible Hulk, for instance, only ran for 6 issues. X-Men was never actually canceled, but it sure did come close. Despite starting off with what seemed like a foolproof formula for success, the new title never caught on. In 1970, X-Men #66 became the last issue of the series to feature new stories, and seemed like it would be the last issue, period. 8 months later, the series returned as a reprint title, perhaps because of the popularity the Beast was seeing elsewhere. That went on for 27 issues of recycled stories, but in 1975, Marvel gave the series another shot by relaunching the title with Giant Size X-Men #1. This story had a brand new direction, a brand new cast, and before long, Marvel had one of the biggest hits in superhero history on their hands. While they're often overshadowed by later additions like Wolverine, the original 5 X-Men will always be the ones who were there when everything started. Cyclops, Iceman, the Angel, Marvel Girl, and Beast form the cornerstone on which everything else was built, and no matter what else happens, they'll always call the X-Men their home. Unless they bailed on a sinking ship and then spent 20 years getting as far away from Charles Xavier's Merry Mutants as they could while still technically existing in the same universe, that is. That's what happened with Hank McCoy, better known to superhero fans as the Beast. While the original X-Men comic itself was never that popular, Fans loved the combination of his monstrous looks and genius intellect, which appealed to a somewhat nerdy fan base. By the early 70s, the Beast had bounced into solo stories in the pages of Amazing Adventures, where he famously turned himself blue and furry, and didn't stop there. Before long, he had joined up with the Avengers, where he would develop a friendship with Wonder Man that would define his character for a decade, and also spent some time on the Defenders. It wasn't until 1991 that he returned to the X-Men. Of course, while he's the most successful, he's not the only original X-Man who was looking for a new gig when the book almost got canceled. Cyclops and Marvel Girl would remain with the team through the 1975 relaunch, but Iceman and the Angel wound up in the Champions alongside Hercules, Ghost Rider, and Black Widow as one of the most random teams in Marvel history. They're mostly known for fighting Swarm, a Nazi whose entire body is made of bees. Not exactly the prestige of the Avengers. The famous Phoenix Saga is arguably the central touchstone of the entire X-Men franchise. It tells the story of Jean Grey being possessed with a cosmic power that corrupted her and led her to destruction on a truly cosmic scale. Eventually, after destroying an entire planet and murdering its entire population to satisfy the Phoenix's endless hunger, Jean was put on a trial on the moon and killed. Sort of. Well, not really. See, the real Jean never did all that stuff at all, since she was busy being in a coma at the bottom of Jamaica Bay. This one gets a little complicated, but here's the short version. Chris Claremont and John Byrne's original plan for the ending of the Phoenix Saga was to have the Phoenix locked away in Jean's mind. Jean would then return to Earth without her powers. Editor-in-Chief Jim Shooter, however, insisted that after killing 1 billion aliens, Jean had to die, and that was that. Years later, though, a series called X-Factor was in the works that would reunite the original 5 X-Men, including Jean. Marvel needed to revive her, but also to separate her from her cosmically genocidal past. The solution? The Phoenix wasn't Jean, and never had been. In the pages of Fantastic Four, of all places, Byrne revealed that when Jean was resurrected as the Phoenix the first time, after crashing a space shuttle into Jamaica Bay, it was actually just the Phoenix Force itself taking Jean's form and memories. The real Jean had been down there in a cocoon for years until she finally emerged, perhaps ironically, like a phoenix. If you grew up getting most of your information about the X-Men from trading cards based on comics from the 90s, then you know 3 things about Wolverine for sure. His bones and claws are laced with an unbreakable metal called adamantium. He was a product of the sinister Canadian super soldier program called Weapon X, and his real name is Logan.
That's my name!
Your name is Logan.
The good news is that the first 2 are still pretty accurate, and also mark one of the only times the words sinister and Canadian are ever put next to each other. It's that third one that could use some updating. In 2001, Marvel decided to make Wolverine's mysterious past a little less mysterious with a miniseries accurately titled Origin. This story revealed that Wolverine was actually James Howlett, who grew up as the sickly son of an extremely wealthy family. Little Jim was, of course, a mutant, but his powers manifested as the result of his father being murdered in front of him, trauma that sparked the first of many memory issues. Also, owing to the all-consuming power of coincidence, he spent his childhood in love with a girl who bore a striking resemblance to Jean Grey and being picked on by a bully who was pretty much just Sabretooth. In 2009, this expanded origin also made it into the movies in the also accurately titled X-Men Origins Wolverine, where the bully actually did turn out to be Sabretooth. Everything ends up tied together, but they never really explain why Jimmy takes the last name of the man who murdered his father. Maybe that was just one of the things that he forgot along the way thanks to being shot in the head with adamantium bullets, but is that really a bad thing? We wouldn't mind losing all of our childhood memories if it meant we never had to remember this movie's version of Deadpool. The X-Men franchise contains some beloved characters, but there's no question at all about who's the most popular. It's absolutely Wolverine, who clawed his way to the top to become a pop culture icon. That's another thing that took a few years to happen. When Wolverine was introduced in the pages of Incredible Hulk number 181, they had no real intentions beyond just filling an editorial mandate to give the Marvel Universe a Canadian superhero. In fact, his creators even figured that, like other mid-70s Hulk adversaries like the Man-Beast or the Cobalt Man, Wolverine would probably show up a couple of times and wind up on the forgotten pages of the official handbook to the Marvel Universe. When an international team of X-Men was created a few months later, though, Wolverine seemed like a natural fit alongside other pre-existing characters like Sunfire and Banshee, even though artist Dave Cockrum, who co-created newcomers like Storm, Nightcrawler, and Colossus, wasn't really a fan of the character. Even in those early X-Men issues, though, Wolverine's never really the focus. He was just a piece of the ensemble cast, to the point where he didn't even make it on the covers most of the time, even when all the other characters do. That all changed with the arrival of John Byrne, who seemed to like Wolverine a lot more than Dave Cockrum did. Not only did he put Wolverine front and center on the cover, his very first issue was a starring role for the Canadian X-Man that began to chip away at his mysterious past. Then came 1977's Uncanny X-Men number 132, where Wolverine survives a devastating attack and spends the next issue clawing his way into rescuing the rest of the team that he really stepped into the spotlight. Needless to say, he hasn't left it since. For a guy mostly known for carrying improbably huge guns, Cable is tough to explain at the best of times. You can be forgiven if you choose to accept the simple explanation that he's Cyclops and Jean's son from the future. That's good enough and complicated enough for most people. It's not quite the whole truth, though. The actual answer? Well, while Jean was presumed dead because her cosmic alien clone body killed itself on the moon, Scott Summers met and eventually married a woman named Madeline Pryor, who looked exactly like Jean with a slightly different haircut. The reason for that resemblance was, of course, that she was a clone of Jean created by Mr. Sinister. Anyway, she got pregnant and gave birth to Nathan Summers, who was infected with the techno-organic virus and sent to the future to be raised by Mother Ascani, who actually was Scott and Jean's daughter Rachel, but from a different future. She also brought Scott and Jean to the future to raise him, which they did under false names, spending years in the post-apocalyptic 37th century before returning to the present day after mere moments. Then, Nathan changed his name to Cable, nobody's quite clear on why, and came back to the present, where he was eventually murdered by a younger version of himself from another timeline. So, you know, pretty simple stuff by X-Men standards.
There's a lot of myths about the Old West out there in the wild, and we're here to run them down, tie them up, and leave them on the train tracks. Here are some false facts about the Wild West you always thought were true, partner. Not so savage natives. You'd be forgiven for thinking that those who settled the untamed American West lived in constant fear of Native Americans. Just pop in any famous Western, sit back, and watch the arrows fly. The truth is, however, that the Native Americans weren't as hostile to those covered wagon travelers as most people believe. While some violent altercations naturally took place, convoys of covered wagons rarely came under attack. Only stragglers ran any real risk, as lone wagons or small groups represented much easier pickings. In reality, many friendly tribes saw groups of settlers as prime trade opportunities. Ultimately, the threat from Indian attack was minimal at best. Along the busiest trails west, Native Americans killed, on record, 362 emigrants between 1840 and 1860. Pair that to the upward of 30,000 total emigrants who died from all causes during the same 20-year span. Truth be told, more Native Americans died at the hands of settlers in that span than vice versa, at 426 total recorded deaths. All that glitters. Everyone thinks California hosted America's first gold rush in 1849, and for good reason. There's the San Francisco 49ers, plus it's even nicknamed the Golden State. But that nugget of wisdom is fool's gold. California wasn't home to the first gold rush, it wasn't even the second. 50 years before some gold nuggets at a California mill triggered the largest mass migration in U.S. history, a 17-pound chunk of the precious metal was discovered in North Carolina, leading to a flood of more than 30,000 prospectors to the Tar Heel State. The great state of Georgia holds claim to America's second gold rush in 1829. The Georgia Journal printed the following notice in August. Cue the music!
Gold! A gentleman of the first respectability in Habersham County writes us thus. 2 gold mines have just been discovered in this county, and preparations are making to bring these hidden treasures of the earth to use.
Only a few months later, northern Georgia was overrun by those hopeful of striking it rich. 20 years before California and its famous 49ers. White lie. The stereotypical image of cowboys as a white, distinctly American invention is just plain false. The deepest roots of the popular cowboy date back to the arrival of the Spanish in Mexico. As ranches spread across modern-day Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico, so too did trained ranchers, called vaqueros, who earned the title of America's first cowboys. And while decades of film and television have conditioned us to incorrectly think that most cowboys at the time were white, 1 in 4 19th century cowboys in the state of Texas, for example, were black. And even more were Mexican, making white cowboys in the state a minority. Sorry to break it to you, Mongo, but the prevalence of your people is kind of historically inaccurate. Don't bank on it. According to popular belief, it would have been safer to keep your money buried under a cactus in the Old West than in a bank, which was robbed by roving bandits on an almost daily basis. In reality, banks at the time were very safe spaces to keep your valuables, perhaps even safer than banks today. According to the Foundation for Economic Freedom, there were fewer than 10 confirmed bank robberies total from 1859 to 1900. That's one heist every 4 years, on average. Hardly an epidemic. In 1974, one historian even claimed the Old West was a far more civilized, more peaceful, and safer place than American society today, as violence and theft was not so culturally ingrained as popular history leads us to believe. Jumping the gun. According to almost every Western ever, the average town had more guns than a well-stocked Walmart in Tennessee. Would you believe that the Old West had stricter gun laws than many states today? It's true. Property owners and ranchers all over called for tight restrictions on firearms with the knowledge that more guns, in the wrong hands, meant more problems.
You want that gun, pick it up. I wish you would.
In fact, frontier towns, places like Tombstone, Deadwood, and Dodge, had the most restrictive gun control laws in the nation. Laws that would make 21st century Second Amendment advocates weep. In many places, cowboys weren't even allowed to carry guns, as they were told that carrying around a six-shooter was not a necessary part of their job. The Kansas newspaper, the Caldwell Commercial, called revolvers a relic of barbarism. Them's fighting words!
Drinking has become so ingrained in our culture that most people just assume they know everything they need to know about alcohol. But it turns out that most of what you think you know is completely wrong. Here's a look at some false facts about alcohol that everyone thought were true, but are actually a lot of bull. Tequila comes with worms. To many, it's not tequila until you stick a big old worm in the bottle. No one knows why, both because it makes no sense at all and because, well, it doesn't happen.
Well, so long as we've got some time to kill, I think I'll have a beer.
We don't have no beer, just tequila.
What's tequila?
Yeah, it's like beer.
First, those worms aren't worms. They're actually moth or butterfly larvae, which, for the record, is still pretty gross. Secondly, these non-worm worms can actually be found in mezcal, not tequila. The two are similar, but with one key difference. In order for an alcoholic beverage to qualify as tequila, it has to be at least 51% blue agave. Mezcal, on the other hand, can be made with other strains of agave. And the worm? Just a really bad marketing gimmick for mezcal that clearly didn't work, since people still think it's tequila. Maybe if they had gone with bulls instead of worms.
Make another bull appear. Hey, you're pretty good.
Mixing different types of alcohol is bad. You know the rhyme, liquor before beer, never fear, but beer before liquor, never sicker. Here's another one. The rhyme is a lie, a stupid rule to go by.
Thanks. I needed that.
That's because science says there is no combination of beer, liquor, and wine that's going to make your hangover worse than usual. There are two major components to causing a hangover: how much you drink and how fast you drink it. Since liquor is both consumed quicker and has a higher concentration of alcohol than beer, you're likely to get sicker and drunk quicker with liquor, regardless of whether you chase it with beer or do it the other way around. If you really want to avoid getting sick, here's a better rule. Consume whatever you want, but in moderation. Alcohol only impairs brain function. Everyone knows that alcohol can slow reaction time and impair thinking, but it turns out that moderation is again the key, because studies have shown that small amounts of alcohol can actually improve your brain function in some ways. It's true. In 2012, researchers discovered that subjects who were given some alcohol and food outperformed sober people when faced with a series of word problems designed to test creativity. And the Health, Alcohol, and Psychosocial Factors in Eastern Europe study found drinking a moderate amount of alcohol every day may improve overall brain function, especially in women. People who drank moderately scored higher on tests that measured everything from verbal skills to memory, and the lowest scores came from those who abstained from alcohol completely. Take that, Temperance League! Bottled beer is better than canned. Next time someone turns their nose up at your can of brew because bottles are better, you can drop this bit of knowledge on them. They actually have it completely backwards. Sure, sipping on a skunky beer will ruin your night really quickly, but the biggest contributors to skunked beer are light, heat, and oxygen. Since cans completely block all light and are perfectly sealed away against air, there are no issues with light or oxidation, problems that can plague even the best bottled beer. Plus, cans are lighter, making them both more convenient and more environmentally friendly. So not only will the beer taste better, it will actually be better for the earth itself. Take that, beer snob.
45 malt liquor.
Absinthe was so dangerous it was illegal. The romance and reputation of absinthe is undeniable. You've probably heard that it causes hallucinations, and it was so dangerous it was banned. Well, no, and not really. It's true that in the early 20th century, temperance crusaders in both America and Europe demonized absinthe as the devil's own concoction, with most of the blame aimed at a chemical in absinthe called thujone. As a result, the United States passed laws saying that absinthe had to be more or less free of thujone in order to be sold in America. However, it turns out that there was some fine print in that law saying that American absinthe could actually contain up to 10 parts per million of thujone. It doesn't sound like much, but modern analysis of 19th century absinthe shows that the amount of thujone in classic strains of the drink varied wildly, from a high of 48 parts per million all the way down to 0. So it turns out plenty of real, authentic absinthe was actually legal all along. And that ban turns out to have been totally pointless anyway, because those tests on old-timey absinthe revealed that there's actually nothing in the drink that causes hallucinations in the first place, not even thujone. The new theory on why absinthe caused so many people to have problems back in the day, because they were just drinking way too much of it. The more things change, the more they stay the same. Different liquors cause different behaviors. You know the person that swears off a certain kind of liquor because they say it makes them mean, sad, or more hungover in the morning? Science says that person is full of it. Yes, scientists have actually studied this because scientists like to drink too. One test involved injecting rats with different kinds of liquor, which sounds both mean and hilarious. Another used human volunteers and monitored how vodka and bourbon impacted their moods. The result? No observable difference. So why does it seem like there is? There are a couple of theories, the main one being that different types of liquor can have different concentrations of alcohol, so you may get drunker and sicker faster drinking one type over another. Science! Alcohol makes you warmer. We love animals and we love alcohol, so of course we love animals that bring us alcohol. We'd totally get stranded in a snowstorm just so we could be found by a big St. Bernard with a little barrel around its neck. Or maybe a bull. Unfortunately, alcohol only makes you feel warmer, while in reality it's actually making you colder. When you drink, the alcohol opens up the blood vessels at the surface of your skin, which is why you turn red and feel warmer. But that increased blood flow is pushed out from your body's core, meaning your core temperature actually drops. Alcohol also inhibits other warming behaviors like shivering, so that brandy-bearing Bernard isn't doing you any favors, no matter how good his intentions might be. Drinking will cure your hangover. Drinking alcohol on the morning after a bender to help kick a hangover isn't just questionable, it's downright dumb. That's because of how hangovers work. Symptoms appear when blood alcohol content reaches 0, so drinking more is just going to postpone the inevitable. Hangovers also include things like an outraged immune system that's rushing to do damage control. Add in alcohol's diuretic effects and irritating effects on your stomach, and drinking more is likely to just make things even worse. So maybe don't do that. Alcohol will help you sleep. This is one so widespread that there's a name for it, a nightcap. Popular belief says a drink will help you sleep, but while it's likely to help you fall asleep faster, the problems will start about midway through the night. Not only will you get less REM sleep than normal, your nightmares will be worse, and if you're prone to sleepwalking, you're more likely to do that too. Just how weird can your dreams get? How about singing a song at a bar with Shaft and his friends before being attacked by a rampaging animal type weird?
No one does it like the bull.
Wine is the only alcohol with health benefits. Every so often, news about the benefits of a nightly glass of wine makes the rounds on social media, and everyone shares it like they've never heard it before. Turns out these benefits aren't just limited to wine though. Beer works as well. In 2016, Pennsylvania State University released their findings based on a survey of 80,000 adults and found that a daily pint or two helped improve cholesterol and also reduce the risk of heart disease and stroke. Beer has also been linked to a decreased risk of kidney stones, clogged arteries, Alzheimer's, cataracts, and diabetes, and it's believed to help strengthen bones and halt the growth of disease. Now that's worth raising a glass to.
Would you believe one wild bull?
It would be easy to think all of Star Wars Jedi secrets have been gleaned from that galaxy far, far away, but here are some fake ones that slipped through. Don't throw a Sith fit if you've fallen for these false Star Wars facts. This often repeated legend that George Lucas wanted to make a grand total of 12 Star Wars movies is mostly based on the misconception that George Lucas was some sort of cinematic prophet who knew from day one that Star Wars would be a hit and that there would be both the means and the demand to continue the franchise for at least a half a century. That all mostly happened, but Lucas had no way of knowing it. The original plan was actually to make one film, because that was the rational approach. Make one film, see how it goes. But then the first film was a crazy success, so Lucas decided to turn the story into a trilogy. Beyond that, no one is really sure what was in his head. National Post says he told Mark Hamill back in 1976 that he planned to make 4 trilogies. But after he finished the tragically wretched prequel series, he famously said, "There will definitely be no episodes 7 through 9.
I got a bad feeling about this.
Even that wasn't the final word, though. In The Secret History of Star Wars, Lucas is said to have envisioned a sequel trilogy beyond Return of the Jedi, and in The Art of the Last Jedi, the author says Luke's hermit storyline was actually Lucas's idea. So even though Lucas has handed the franchise over to Disney, it's clear that his influence will live on, no matter how many movies are eventually made. Everyone knows the real protagonist of Star Wars is Darth Vader. That's made pretty explicitly clear in the prequels, where we follow young Anakin Skywalker on his painfully acted journey from young slave and pod racer prodigy to cybernetic Dark Lord. Even if you've never realized that Darth Vader is the anti-hero star of the entire franchise, there's no question the iconic character is surrounded by some pretty rich mythology. We now know all that stuff about Darth Vader falling into lava was totally true, but the mythology behind his name is based on misconceptions. According to In a Galaxy Far, Far Away, Lucas himself said Darth Vader's name came from the Dutch Vader, meaning father. Darth was simply a variation of dark, which makes way more sense than Donker, which is the Dutch word for dark. Imagine a Dark Lord called Donker Vader. Yeah, that's not a Star Wars we want to see.
I find your lack of faith disturbing.
Anyway, the idea that Darth Vader's name means Dark Father and therefore alludes to Luke's parentage is not very credible when you consider that Lucas didn't decide Darth Vader was actually going to be Luke's dad until the second draft of The Empire Strikes Back. We still don't know, though, if Lucas actually did pick Vader because it meant father, but if he did, it certainly wasn't a way to hint at the big reveal to come, because Lucas didn't know there was even going to be a big reveal. The Empire Strikes Back opens with Luke getting his ass handed to him by a Wampa, which scratches his face, drags him off to its icy lair, and hangs him upside down. Legend says this scene was really just a handy way to explain why Luke's face was all messed up after actor Mark Hamill got into a car accident in January of 1977. The accident damaged his left cheekbone and messed up his nose badly enough that doctors had to repair it with cartilage from his ear. So his face didn't really look the same in The Empire Strikes Back as it did in A New Hope. But Lucas says the Wampa scene wasn't written expressly for the purpose of explaining Luke's injuries. Instead, it was a typical movie-making device. They just wanted to open the film with some suspense.
R2 says the chances of survival are 725 to 1.
Carrie Fisher remembered that the scene was altered to account for Luke's injuries, but that basically just confirms what Lucas said. The scene was already there, but the face injury was added to help viewers understand the origins of Skywalker's scars. One of the most iconic scenes from The Empire Strikes Back, second to only Vader's Maury moment,
"You are the father!"
is Han Solo's goodbye to Princess Leia. She says, "I love you," and he says, "I know." It's about as Han Solo-ish as any line ever spoken by Harrison Ford during the trilogy, and yet it's nowhere to be found in the script. Somehow, this line inspired a legend. Harrison Ford improvised it while the cameras were rolling, and everyone marveled at its brilliance. But like all legends, the true story this is based on is way more boring than what we've been believing. It is true that Harrison Ford wrote the line. According to CBR, in the original script, Leia professes her love, and then Han Solo says the slightly less Han Solo-ish but still kinda Han Solo-ish, "Just remember that, 'cause I'll be back." Now, Terminator wouldn't hit theaters for another 4 years, and cinematic history would be all cockeyed if Han Solo became famous for saying,
"I'll be back."
Fortunately for cinematic history, Ford didn't think the line was quite right, so he suggested "I know" to director Irvin Kershner. But it was well in advance of the actual shoot. The only person who didn't seem sure about the whole "I know" thing was George Lucas, who decided to shoot both versions of the scene and then play them for a test audience, who reportedly liked the "I know" scene so much that Lucas didn't even bother to test the other one. Okay, so you had to know this was coming, right? Perhaps no other Star Wars character is as despised as Jar Jar Binks. Jar Jar was supposed to be a good guy, yet the collective hatred for his character dwarfs anything anyone ever felt for Watto, Boss Nass, or those annoying pod racer announcers whose names we can't remember. So why was this character so very, very detestable? There can only be one reason. He was evil. This actually seems so plausible that one Reddit user came up with a theory that Jar Jar was actually intended to be a villain, and then the internet went, "Oh yeah, that seems like it could be true." According to Forbes, the theory even reached the ears of George Lucas, who unsurprisingly said fans shouldn't get too excited, so from that we can pretty much glean that it's false. However, and this is a hefty, hut-sized however, Jar Jar Binks actor Ahmed Best thinks the theory might make a weird kind of sense, though he remains pretty tight-lipped about the specifics. In March 2016, he told YouTuber Jamie Stangroom, "There's a lot about the Darth Jar Jar theory that's true. There are some things about it that are not true. Could Jar Jar have evolved into that? I think the answer is yes." There you have it, folks, straight from the actor's mouth. Before television, there was Greek mythology. It too was full of heroes, villains, betrayals, abductions, murders, and other fun stuff we love to see happen to other people. Greek mythology has been retold so many times for so many centuries that our modern understanding of it is sometimes a little bit off. In fact, the modern mix of pop culture and actual mythology has left us with a sort of twisted idea about the Greek myths. Let's straighten that out. Ancient Greece. You'll often hear people talk about how things were back in ancient Greece, but we have some bad news. There really wasn't ever any one ancient Greece. According to Professor of Greek Culture Paul Cartledge, the Greek Empire was divided up into city-states. There were over 1,000 of these from Turkey to France. There was no globalization in those days, so even though the city-states existed under the umbrella of the Greek Empire, they had very different traditions. That means the Greek myths we're all familiar with were not consistent from one part of the Greek Empire to another, and the gods and goddesses considered important also varied by region. The Trojan War. While we're talking history, or lack thereof, here's another one for you. The image of the wooden horse full of malevolent Greek soldiers is such a part of world consciousness that most people never question whether it actually happened. The Trojan War story appears in Homer's poem The Iliad, which was written in the 8th or 9th century BC. So far, historians haven't been able to find evidence that the characters in the story actually existed. Helen, supposedly the whole reason for the war, is probably total fiction. But Homer may have based his story on a real city. In 1870, a German adventurer excavated a 9-layer city in Turkey and found what he believed to be Helen's jewels. He was wrong. The jewels predated fictional Helen by 1,000 years. But he did reveal a city that resembled fictional Troy. The city appears to have perished in an earthquake. So archaeologists came up with a rather tenuously connected theory. Maybe, just maybe, the Trojan horse was symbolic of Poseidon, who was the god of horses, as well as the sea and of earthquakes, like the one that brought the city to rubble.
I'm not expecting you to forgive me.
Greek Satan. In the Christian tradition, the underworld is ruled by Satan. He's all about tempting innocent humans to the dark side and then throwing them into a pit of hellfire for all eternity. To reconcile this with Greek mythology, most people project the fire and brimstone of hell, along with the evil of its overlord, onto lords of the underworld from other traditions. But that concept of pure evil doesn't really exist in the Greek tradition. Hades was indeed god of the dead, but was not the bright red, horned, cloven-hoofed monster we like to imagine sits on a throne in the underworld. Hades not only ruled the kingdom of the dead and presided at funerals, he was also god of the hidden wealth of the earth, which meant that fertile soil and mines were under his domain as well. Pandora's box. In what's perhaps our most shocking revelation, the box that Pandora famously opened, which set forth all the world's evils, was not actually a box. It was a jar. Pandora was the first human created by the gods. They made her out of clay and then pretty much immediately married her off to some random god. As a wedding present, Zeus gave her a jar. Maybe she thought it had homemade jam in it or something because she opened it. Instead of delicious strawberry preserves, though, the jar was full of evil spirits. The spirits flew away to plague mankind forever and leave us marveling at what a total jerk move it was on Zeus's part to even gift evil spirits in the first place. There's no going back from that.
Pandora doesn't go back in the box.
Cupid and love. Valentine's Day is associated with Cupid, even though Valentine was a Christian saint said to have performed secret marriages after the practice was outlawed. So how did Cupid get mixed up in all this? He was the Roman version of Eros, the Greek god of love. On Valentine's Day, Eros/Cupid is usually depicted as a chubby baby with wings. But in the Greek stories, he was an adult and kinda sinister. Instead of helping young lovers connect, Eros preferred to mess with people's heads. He had 2 quivers, one with golden arrows, which made the recipient fall in love, and the other with lead arrows, which made the recipient roll their eyes in disgust at the person who was on the receiving end of the golden arrow. Maybe his transformation from adult male giver of misery to cute chubby baby with wings makes a certain amount of sense. There are already plenty of things to torment us. We don't need to be tormented by the god of love, too.
Few bands have been through quite so much as Fleetwood Mac, and when a band is so overcome with love, anger, jealousy, and success, a few mistruths and urban myths are bound to spring up. Here are some of the false things you may believe about Fleetwood Mac. When most people think of Fleetwood Mac, the first songs that come to mind are pop rock hits such as Rhiannon or Dreams. Indeed, the arena rock sound that dominated charts in the late 1960s and 70s had a significant influence on the group. Still, Fleetwood Mac didn't actually begin as a California sound pop rock group. They were originally a blues band that sought to pay tribute to their American blues heroes. The original Fleetwood Mac lineup was born out of the remnants of another band, John Mayall's Blues Breakers. Mayall had been a staple in British electric blues since the 1950s, earning him the honorific title of the Godfather of British blues. John McVie, Mick Fleetwood, and Peter Green weren't the only musicians who got their start with Mayall either. Eric Clapton, Mick Taylor, and Andy Fraser all passed through Mayall's Blues Breakers before finding later success.
John usually chooses the people he wants. Chooses very carefully, he knows what he wants, he usually gets it too.
Green was selected by Mayall to replace Clapton, who departed to form the supergroup Cream. No easy task, sure, but Green's tenure in the band was successful enough to make him a music legend in his own right. And it was only then that he left to form Fleetwood Mac with McVie, Fleetwood, and slide guitarist Jeremy Spencer. Fleetwood Mac has had a revolving door of band members over the years, and surprisingly enough, that included John McVie. For the first 3 months of Fleetwood Mac's existence, another man played bass while McVie continued to play in the Blues Breakers. This early version of Fleetwood Mac made their debut at the 1967 National Jazz and Blues Festival, with Bob Brunning on bass. While Green, Fleetwood, and McVie were all members of John Mayall's Blues Breakers, McVie had been a member longer than the other two, and had looked to Mayall as a kind of mentor. As such, he didn't want to leave to form another group, especially once he doubted he could stand out against legions of other British blues bands. So McVie stayed with the Blues Breakers, and Green and Fleetwood brought on Brunning, a college student who was a member of the group Fives Company. Despite understanding that McVie would become the group's bassist if he left the Blues Breakers, Brunning left school and took the job. McVie eventually left Mayall, however, and Brunning's stint in Fleetwood Mac was over. In the end, he only played on one recorded song, Long Grey Mare, that featured on their debut album. Brunning went on to play in a number of other bands, later became an educator, and even opened his own blues club. Despite the fact that the band is named after them, drummer Mick Fleetwood and bassist John McVie weren't actually seen as the band's leaders in their early days. Although Fleetwood would become de facto leader later on, at the beginning, the leadership role fell on Peter Green. In fact, Green's command of the band was so great that around their first album, the band was known as Peter Green's Fleetwood Mac. Green was far from a dictator though. A rather humble man, he didn't enjoy being considered a guitar hero. He even told guitarist Jeremy Spencer that he had planned to one day leave the band, and so wanted to give the bandmates something in return. He said, "They're my friends. What are they going to have? I'm going to leave them with a name." Hence, Fleetwood Mac was born, when Green combined the names of Mick Fleetwood and John McVie. Green also pushed back at the label's decision to name their self-titled debut album Peter Green's Fleetwood Mac, and it was released with his name removed. When discussing his friend and ex-bandmate, Fleetwood had this to say to the Irish Times: "Peter could have been the stereotypical superstar guitar player and control freak, but that wasn't his style. Peter Green is the reason there's a Fleetwood Mac." British blues in the 1960s was a gold mine for hit singles, and while Fleetwood Mac's later lineup had more commercial and critical success, the Proto-Mac still had plenty to be proud of in those early days. During the period that Peter Green was a member of Fleetwood Mac, the band had 7 songs hit the top 40 on the United Kingdom singles charts, including a #1 hit with the instrumental track Albatross, and their songs Man of the World and Oh Well peaked at #2 on the singles chart. After their self-titled debut failed to generate a single hit, however, the band expanded their sound from strictly blues and brought in influences from different musical elements. 2 of their 3 hits from 1968, Black Magic Woman and Albatross, reflected these changes. The group's second album, Mr. Wonderful, marked this change in sound, as Fleetwood Mac became a band that used the blues as a starting point rather than being a blues band outright. By their 3rd studio album, which was their last with Green, the band were continuing this musical evolution to a pop-rock sound, now simply using the blues as a kind of bass influence. The band had doubtless changed a lot since their early days, and Fleetwood Mac were about to find the sound that made them legends. In 1970, after releasing the band's 3rd studio album, Peter Green's mental state had reached its breaking point. Green's undiagnosed schizophrenia and a particularly bad drug trip while on tour in Germany led him to leave the band he had formed. Sadly, Green would be troubled by his mental illness for a long time. Nonetheless, he did come back to play with Fleetwood Mac every now and again. Only 3 years after Green left the band, he returned for a single song on their 1973 album, Penguin, although his contribution to the song Night Watch went uncredited. Then, on Mick Fleetwood's 1981 solo album, The Visitor, Green re-recorded his classic song Rattlesnake Shake, which he had originally recorded with the band in 1969. On one of the band's most successful albums, Tusk, Green played guitar on the song Brown Eyes. In a 1999 interview, Green explained that he didn't even remember recording that song, blaming his ill memory on his declining health during that time period. Luckily, Green eventually overcame his issues with drugs and underwent treatment for his mental health issues. Despite persistent rumors that he might rejoin the group for a live performance in the 2000s, however, this never came to pass before he passed away in July 2020. The beginning of the 1970s and Peter Green's departure from the group marked the end of the original Fleetwood Mac, and you might assume the beginning of the most successful version of the band. But though the lineup that featured Stevie Nicks and Lindsey Buckingham became easily the most well-known, there was actually a period between the Green era and the later era that most fans seem to have forgotten. During this in-between period, the remainder of the band released 6 studio albums, more than they put out with either of their other lineups. For their first post-Green album, Kiln House, the group returned to their roots in classic 1950s rock, similar to that of Buddy Holly and Gene Vincent. The album sold poorly, however, and Jeremy Spencer departed the group soon after. Their next album, Future Games, saw keyboardist and singer Christine McVie officially become a member of the group. The wife of John McVie, Christine had contributed to Fleetwood Mac's music since their second album. Unfortunately, Future Games failed to garner much success and was panned by the critics. Their next 4 albums were pretty much more of the same, until Nicks and Buckingham joined for the band's 1975 self-titled album. While Fleetwood Mac were infamous for the relationships between the band's various members, only John and Christine McVie were actually married. Stevie Nicks and Lindsey Buckingham, though a talented duo and couple before joining the group, never actually got hitched. The pair first met at high school when Nicks came across Buckingham covering the Mamas and the Papas hit song California Dreamin', at which point Nicks spontaneously joined in the harmonies. Buckingham called Nicks 2 years after their initial meeting, asking her to join his band, Fritz. By 1973, Fritz had disbanded, and so Nicks and Buckingham released their first album as a duo and as a couple. 2 years after that album, they were given the opportunity of a lifetime when they joined an already established band, Fleetwood Mac. When Bustle later interviewed Nix about her life at the time, during a profile on celebrities when they were 28 years old, she said, "I probably have the best 28 story of anybody that you will interview." By this point, however, the relationship was already deteriorating. Nix claimed that Buckingham was controlling and distrustful, and by the time their second album with Fleetwood Mac rolled around, the pair were writing and recording songs that gave their own versions of their breakup. Speaking about her relationship with Buckingham, Nix once said, "He and I were about as compatible as a boa constrictor and a rat." For about 4 decades, Tom Petty and Stevie Nicks enjoyed a close relationship that spawned a number of collaborations between them. However, despite their closeness, the pair's relationship always remained platonic. Originally, Petty and Nix's friendship was pretty one-sided. In the late 1970s, while Nix was at her peak with Fleetwood Mac, she heard Petty's music as the frontman of Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. Nix was so intoxicated by the music that she started modeling her own music after Petty, and went to extreme lengths to get in contact with him. Seemingly more than anything else, Nix wanted to join Petty's band. But Petty declined Nix's request to join the Heartbreakers. Nonetheless, Petty and his band all played music on Nix's first solo album, Belladonna, which was produced by Nix's boyfriend and Petty's producer, Jimmy Iovine. All but one song on the album was written by Nix, with the other, Stop Draggin' My Heart, being written by Petty himself. At the time, Petty had given Nix a different song to perform, Insider, but she returned it to him because she saw how much he loved it. Nix requested a different song, and Stop Draggin' My Heart was the result. The two maintained a close friendship until Petty's death in 2017. Before he passed, Petty gave in to Nix's original request and finally made her an honorary heartbreaker. They say time heals all wounds, from Mick Jagger and Keith Richards to Dr. Dre and Ice Cube. Bandmates who feud often kiss and make up. After a while, that is. Famously, Fleetwood Mac's Lindsey Buckingham would fight with his bandmates on his worst days, and on his best days there'd still be at least a little tension, most notably between him and his ex-partner Stevie Nicks. While John and Christine McVie have been able to overcome their messy divorce and continue performing to this day, the same cannot be said for Nicks and Buckingham. In fact, this became such a problem for the group that Buckingham was kicked out of Fleetwood Mac in 2018. Buckingham said the boot came from Nicks herself, who gave the band an ultimatum to choose between herself or Buckingham.
And it would be like something as absurd as Mick Jagger saying, either Keith goes or I go, well, I guess we need the singer.
Naturally, Buckingham responded to the departure by suing his former band. The two sides eventually reached an undisclosed settlement, and Buckingham was replaced with Mike Campbell, guitarist of the Heartbreakers, and Neil Finn of Crowded House. Any hope for a true reunion seems to have been quashed, too, as Mick Fleetwood later told the NME that Buckingham will never again reunite with the band. So, there you have it. Ever-changing lineups, bitter resentment, and endless relationship drama. Who else but Fleetwood Mac?
Thanksgiving seems so straightforward. Pilgrims, Native Americans, turkeys, fun. But how much of what you think you know about Thanksgiving is really true? Here are false things everyone believes about Thanksgiving. Every kid with a third-grade education knows the first Thanksgiving was in Plymouth, Massachusetts in 1621, and that it promptly turned into a beloved annual tradition. You know, turkeys with big hats that have buckles for some reason. All of that. But actually, that's not exactly true. The Mayflower immigrants did have a celebratory harvest feast in 1621, but according to the New York Times, it wasn't until the 1830s that people in New England claimed a link between that historical event and the totally unrelated annual feast they had been celebrating for years. The people of Plymouth did have religious events to give thanks for major events like the end of a dry season, but they were days of fasting, not feasting. If you hopped into a time machine and traveled backward to that first Thanksgiving, which we now know wasn't actually Thanksgiving, and started asking around for the Pilgrims, you would have gotten a lot of blank stares. That's because they didn't refer to themselves as Pilgrims. According to history, they called themselves Separatists or Saints. In their own writings, they sometimes referred to themselves as Planters. Later settlers called them Old Comers. There were a few uses of the word pilgrim in the mid-1600s writings of William Bradford, governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, But it wasn't until the late 1700s that people started reading those diaries and began applying the name Pilgrims to the first English immigrants. So, the first Thanksgiving wasn't called Thanksgiving, and it was celebrated by pilgrims who weren't actually called pilgrims. Makes sense. Because we think of Thanksgiving as a pilgrim thing, we naturally assume that we aren't just celebrating the things that we as modern humans are thankful for. We're also celebrating the triumphs of the pilgrims. We're remembering their struggle for religious freedom, their perseverance in a hostile new world, their bonds with their new Native American allies, and most of all, their survival through that first long, brutal winter. Except we're actually not celebrating that at all. What we're really celebrating is the Union victory at the Battle of Gettysburg. Thanksgiving was first declared an official annual event in 1863, and it was Abraham Lincoln who did it. And he wasn't thinking back to the trials and tribulations of the Pilgrims. He was thinking about recent events. The North had just defeated the South at the Battle of Gettysburg, and that's what he wanted America to be thankful for. And since Americans love time off to eat food, the tradition caught on. Thanks, General George Meade. One reason we admire the Pilgrims so much is the belief that they came to America to find religious freedom. And according to conventional wisdom, when they found it, they celebrated with that first Thanksgiving. Of course, none of that is actually true. That's because the Pilgrims weren't actively facing religious persecution when they decided to come to America. They were already free of it because they'd fled England 10 years earlier to settle in the Netherlands. But life in the Netherlands wasn't exactly awesome for the Pilgrims. According to the Plymouth Plantation, most of the Pilgrims worked long hours in the cloth trade for very little money. To make matters worse, their kids were starting to think of themselves as Dutch. So, after some soul-searching, the Pilgrims decided to move to America, where there would be religious freedom, but also economic opportunity, as well as the freedom to remain English. They signed on with a company called the Plymouth Company, which promised them passage, plus clothing, tools, and other supplies. In return, the Pilgrims had to send natural resources back to England for a period of 7 years. As a bonus, the Pilgrims also got to establish their very own totalitarian religion and use it to argue against religious freedom for everyone else. So, yay? So, remember that whole thing about Thanksgiving being a celebration where the Pilgrims invited their native allies from the Wampanoag tribe to celebrate their new friendship and mutual respect? Well, there's another thing that's not necessarily true. According to Indian Country Today, there was some cooperation between the settlers and the Wampanoags, but it wasn't all fun and games. It was mostly based on mutual need. As it turned out, in a big stroke of luck for the English, a terrible epidemic had just swept through New England right before they arrived. Nobody is quite sure what the disease was, but it killed millions of people, reducing the population by up to 90% in a period of just a few years. So when the Pilgrims arrived, there was a bunch of empty land waiting. In fact, the town of Plymouth was originally a Patuxet village that was left vacant after all the inhabitants died during the plague. There was only one Patuxet left alive, Tisquantum, known today as Squanto, who only survived because he'd been kidnapped and taken to Europe as a slave at the time of the epidemic. Tisquantum and the Wampanoags had one thing in common with the Pilgrims. They needed friends. That's because other tribes in the area, like the Narragansetts, hadn't been affected as much by the epidemic and thus suddenly had a military advantage. So an alliance was born between the Wampanoags and the Pilgrims. Despite all that, though, some historians believe that the Wampanoags weren't actually invited to the first harvest feast in 1621. Instead, it's likely that the natives heard the Pilgrims firing their muskets, thus beginning that all-too-American tradition of drinking too much at a party and then grabbing a gun. So the natives thought the Pilgrims needed help and crashed the party.
Hey, do you guys think the Pilgrims brought a bottle of Pinot Grigio to the first Thanksgiving?
I'll tell you what the Pilgrims did bring. Smallpox.
Turkey is so traditional that the mere suggestion of cooking something else on Thanksgiving is usually met with gasps of scandalized horror, even if it's something sensible like roast beef or ham. And we won't even mention those who want to go completely off the Thanksgiving train with something messed up like a turducken. So why is turkey such a tradition on the American table? It has to be because that's what the Pilgrims ate, right? Actually, no. Or maybe because they definitely ate a lot of the stuff. But even if turkey was one of those things, then it certainly wasn't the centerpiece of the feast. According to Fortune, that honor goes to venison. Once they knew what was going on, the Wampanoag reportedly brought 5 deer to the party. And that was a big deal for the Pilgrims, because back in England, it was illegal to hunt deer. It was reserved for the nobility. So eating venison was a real delicacy. In fact, the Pilgrims were actually so excited about being able to eat venison that they were constantly talking about it in letters back home, which was probably irritating to all the hungry relatives in England wishing they could munch on some deer jerky. There was other stuff on the menu too, but we can really only guess what those things were. Shellfish, squash, cornbread, berries, and plums are all likely. No potatoes or cranberries though, and no turkey that we know of.
Here.
Dad, what are you trying to do?
It's Thanksgiving! I didn't know your girlfriend was a goddamn turkey!
It may be a Thanksgiving tradition, but not everyone thinks pumpkin pie is a delicious treat. In fact, some find pumpkin pie to be downright disgusting. Pumpkin is a squash, the argument goes, and squash does not belong in your dessert, as evidenced by both the taste and the texture. So maybe it will come as a relief to learn that pumpkin pie was not an invention of the Pilgrims, nor is it likely that they ate it at that first harvest feast. According to What's Cooking America, the Pilgrims didn't have the kind of ovens you'd need to bake a pie, and if they had those ovens, they almost certainly would have baked something like a berry or plum pie, not pumpkin. Pilgrims did occasionally eat pumpkins because when you're starving, you'll eat anything. One popular way of eating pumpkin was to slice off the top and fill the insides with milk, honey, and spices, and then bake it in hot ashes, which actually does sound worse than a pumpkin pie. But that's the tradition that probably led to the pumpkin pie as Thanksgiving's undeserved signature dessert. At least modern whipped cream is an upgrade. According to tradition, every year the President of the United States of America selects a random turkey and pardons it, thus sparing the turkey from being eaten. And according to this same tradition, it has been thus since President Harry S. Truman first jokingly pardoned a turkey back in 1947. A couple of things though. Firstly, according to the Truman Library, there's no record at all of this ever happening. Truman, it turns out, was regularly given a gift of turkey by the National Turkey Federation and the Poultry and Egg National Board, but it was usually at Christmas, not Thanksgiving. And far from pardoning it, Truman was known to comment about how he and his family were definitely going to eat it. So where did this tradition actually come from? While some claim that it was Lincoln who started it by pardoning his son Tad's pet turkey during the Civil War, according to Snopes, it was President Ronald Reagan who first mentioned pardoning a turkey as a joke. His successor, George H.W. Bush, decided to be that guy by taking the joke too far and actually pardoning a real turkey. And this is apparently how the tradition actually started. Ironically, most pardoned Thanksgiving turkeys only live for a couple of years because they're bred to be fat and tasty, which means their bodies aren't usually compatible with life. When your friends or family groan that they could not possibly help with the dishes because of the turkey coma, most people just sigh with acceptance, because every armchair scientist knows that the levels of the chemical tryptophan found in turkey is so high that it makes people artificially sleepy. Here's the thing though, that's not the whole truth. Sure, turkey has tryptophan, but so do a lot of other foods, like cheese, fish, and eggs. What's different about Thanksgiving is that people eat a ton of food. And besides turkey, they're likely eating all sorts of carbs like mashed potatoes, bread rolls, and stuffing. When you eat a lot of carbs, your body produces insulin, and the insulin removes amino acids from your body, except for some reason tryptophan, which then has free reign to party inside your head. Once in your brain, it forms serotonin and melatonin, which is what makes you want to pass out on the couch and not do dishes. So it turns out the so-called turkey coma is really caused by everything else on the table. And all you have to do to avoid it is not eat so much. Sorry, turkey breath, but it's time to do your share of the dishes. One popular myth holds that the term Black Friday refers to black ink because it's the day when merchants finally start to turn a profit after a long, hard, broke rest of the year. Up until then, supposedly, they've had to do their accounting in red ink, which signifies a loss. But thanks to Americans shopping until they drop in a mad pre-Christmas binge, on Black Friday, all those merchants can finally break out the black pens to mark a profit. Sounds perfectly capitalistic, but it's also a load of hooey. According to Snopes, the term Black Friday was first sarcastically used in 1951 by employers who were annoyed that their employees always called in sick the day after Thanksgiving. by the 1960s, police were using it too to describe the chaos of the first day of the holiday shopping season. And that eventually evolved into the urban legend we have now. Today, of course, no one really cares why it's called Black Friday, as long as there'll be an awesome deal on the new iPhone. And it's that kind of opportunity for their descendants that the Pilgrims were truly giving thanks for.
The Joker is the most recognizable comic book supervillain of all time, but pinning down the facts is harder than it sounds. You've probably always believed these misconceptions about the Joker. Put a smile on that face and learn the truth. Most people think they know the Joker's origin. He was a gangster called the Red Hood who one day ran afoul of Batman, fell into a vat of toxic chemicals, and came out with his skin dyed chalk white and his mouth twisted into a grin. The classic narrative first showed up way back in 1951, but was enhanced by Alan Moore and Brian Boland's The Killing Joke, which added even more tragic details. It's a popular origin story, but calling it definitive is a bit of a stretch.
Wait till they get a load of me.
As we saw on the screen in The Dark Knight, the Joker often tells contradictory stories of his past. The Red Hood tale was meant to be a secret origin in the beginning, but he's also told different stories over the years. He's claimed that his white skin was caused by his abusive aunt scrubbing him with bleach as a boy, or that his trademark smile was actually the result of Batman's batarang slicing his lips open. All these origin stories might be complete lies, and that's the point. The less we know, the creepier he is. Despite what you might have heard, Gotham's scariest criminal has no confirmed origin and no confirmed name.
Nothing in his pockets but knives and lint.
You've probably heard the name Jack Napier, but that was created for Tim Burton's 1989 Batman movie. It's actually the combination of two different influences. Not only is it a pun on jackanapes, another term for a loudmouth fool, or you know, a joker, it's also a tribute to Alan Napier, the actor who played Alfred in the campy 1960s TV series. Outside of the film, however, the Joker's name is almost always listed as unknown. It's worth noting that in 2017, writer Sean Gordon Murphy elected to use the Jack Napier identity for his comic book Batman White Knight, a story about the Joker being cured of his insanity and dedicating his life to helping Gotham City by ridding it of Batman. As interesting as it is, White Knight is not considered an official part of continuity and is heavily influenced by Batman the Animated Series, where Jack Napier was once used as one of the Joker's many aliases. The Joker has always been a popular villain, but Heath Ledger's performance in The Dark Knight definitively reinvented the character for the 2000s and earned Ledger a posthumous Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor. When Ledger tragically passed away from a sedative overdose in the months leading up to the film's release, plenty of moviegoers were willing to accept the idea that the actor's death was due to him feeling haunted by his sinister performance. The truth is neither that simple nor that sensational. In the documentary I Am Heath Ledger, among other places, Ledger's sister Kate has directly spoken out against claims that the Joker role killed her brother, saying he had an amazing sense of humor, and I guess maybe only his family and friends knew that, but he was having fun. He wasn't depressed about the Joker. Ledger had struggled with insomnia for years, long before his Joker days, and it's believed that his overuse of sedatives to treat it may have actually begun after his breakup with Michelle Williams. By all accounts, his overdose was a tragic accident. Batman definitely hates the Joker, how could he not? The Clown Prince of Crime is the antithesis of everything Batman stands for, and has made a habit of killing Bruce Wayne's loved ones. However, what makes their rivalry so interesting is that the Joker absolutely loves everything about Batman, maybe even to a romantic degree. In Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns, Batman hangs up his cape for a decade, and Joker is so depressed by the retirement of his partner that he falls into a nearly catatonic state. When Batman returns, Joker's life is given purpose again, and he goes on a new streak of mass murders. The Joker's crimes aren't done despite Batman's interference, but because he wants Batman's attention. He's even gone as far as saying that he hopes his conflict with Batman goes on forever. There's a reason this was the entire plot of the Lego Batman movie.
You're the reason I've given up a life spent with Russian ballerinas and lady activewear models.
Aside from the fact that real-life bats never really fight real-life clowns, the dynamic between Batman and the Joker is unbelievably perfect. Batman is a dark hero who creeps in the shadows, facing off against a bright, colorful villain who walks in broad daylight. Batman has dedicated his life to preserving and restoring order through intense training and planning, and the Joker, well...
Some men just want to watch the world burn.
It's so perfect that it must have been planned that way from the very beginning, right? Wrong. At the beginning, Joker was never supposed to be Batman's archenemy. When the clown first showed up in the pages of 1940's Batman #1, the original plan was to kill off Joker after only 2 appearances, both within the same issue. Bizarre as it might sound today, the villain was rescued by intervention from above. When the creative team drafted Joker dying from a knife wound in Batman #1, editor Whitney Ellsworth thought the character had too much potential and instructed the artist to insert an additional panel depicting the villain being rescued by an ambulance. Considering how popular this killer clown has become in the decades since, it seems like Ellsworth made the right call. One of the most enduring elements of the Batman mythos is the idea that his secret identity is absolutely necessary.
Bruce Wayne, why are you dressed up like Batman?
Not only is he acting outside of the law himself, but it also stands to reason that if the bad guys knew who he was and where he lived, Wayne Manor would be a crater within 24 hours. 22 if Harvey Dent was involved. With that in mind, it seems like it would be catastrophic if Batman's arch-nemesis the Joker learned who it was beneath the mask. Don't be fooled though, Joker might not invade Wayne Manor every week, but he knows many secrets about the man behind the mask. While it was hinted at before, the Joker's knowledge of Batman's secret identity came to light in Scott Snyder and Greg Capullo's Endgame storyline. The thing is, Joker neither cares about nor wants to engage with Bruce Wayne's life. It's Batman he wants to play with.
Final Fantasy is one of the longest-running and most beloved series in video game history, featuring hundreds of characters spread out over almost 20 core games and even more offshoots. When a game universe gets this popular and unruly, there are bound to be myths and rumors popping up. Here's a look at some false facts about Final Fantasy you always thought were true. Set up to fail. One of the most persistent myths about the Final Fantasy series is that Square, in a thrilling underdog story, named their 1987 RPG Final Fantasy because they thought it would be the last game they'd ever make before going belly up. Obviously, Square went on to make $1 zillion and 1 zillion more Final Fantasy games and tie-in products. Pleasing in Japanese. They actually wanted to go with the far more aggressive title, Fighting Fantasy, but that name was already taken. Instead, they settled on Final Fantasy, which even Sakaguchi admits has caused some logic problems.
Final Fantasy 2? That doesn't even make sense!
Aeris can be revived. It's one of the most shocking and iconic scenes in gaming history. Halfway through Final Fantasy VII, Sephiroth stabs Flower Girl Aeris in the back with his sword, killing her instantly. This wasn't the usual RPG death, where a character is just technically KO'd until you Phoenix down them back to consciousness. This death was the real deal, a bold, rare move for a video game in 1997. It was such a stunning scene, in fact, that rumors started circulating right away about methods to bring Aeris back from the dead. Surely she can't be dead for real, right? 2 decades after the game was released, heartbroken gamers still flock to websites and forums looking for hope, but there's none to be found. There is no possible way to revive or keep Aeris alive without cheating, except for choosing to never reach the point in the game where she dies. Squall is dead. In sort of an inverse to the bring back dead people rumors, there's a persistent myth that Squall in Final Fantasy VIII is actually dead after the end of Disc 1, and the other 3 discs are just a vision he has as he's kicking the bucket. But besides being a hacky trope too far-fetched even for Square, it just doesn't make any sense, as many gamers online have outlined. The theory is great for fanfic, but in the real world, not so much. Turtle power. Blame Conan O'Brien for this one. On the talk show host's hilarious Clueless Gamer Final Fantasy 15 segment, O'Brien is told that battling the towering Adamantoids would take a whopping 72 hours of real time to defeat.
Why would someone play this? Why would someone play this game?
The legend of the Adamantoids grew when game director Hajime Tamata claimed that wasn't quite right, and that it was more like 15 hours. Like that's any better. Fortunately, YouTubers have since whittled that down to 6 minutes or less. Of course, fans had reason to believe Square Enix was capable of such insanity. In 2008, Final Fantasy XI made headlines after the world's elite players spent 18 hours trying to defeat the boss Pandemonium Warden, only to give up after several people began barfing and passing out from the effort. Still not the most annoying thing Square Enix has ever done, though.
I'm the Bosch von Ronsenberg. Bosch lives! Bosch lives! Bosch lives! Bosch lives!
N64 Flim Flam. In October 1995, GameFan magazine published a story claiming that Square was developing a new game called Final Fantasy VII for the N64, with a tentative release date of December 1996. One problem: none of that was true. In fact, the demo that the folks at GameFan had seen wasn't Final Fantasy VII, and it wasn't for the N64. Instead, it was a mock-up called Final Fantasy VI, the interactive CG game, designed to showcase what a 3D Final Fantasy game might look like in the future. And it was never intended to be released at all. Way to get literally everything wrong, diehard game fan. Barret is Final Fantasy's first black character. While Barret from Final Fantasy VII was definitely the first black character in the series to take on a starring role in the saga,
by the way, what are your names?
He wasn't actually the first black character in the series, as some fans might think. That title goes, believe it or not, to General Leo from Final Fantasy VI. Of course, this is what you're probably thinking. General Leo looks like Macklemore. What are you even talking about? While it's true his in-game sprite looked Caucasian due supposedly to palette limitations, his in-game character portrait and his promotional art portray him as black with a blonde mohawk. So toss that image of Macklemore and replace it with Simon Phoenix.
Let's face it, a cat's cuteness factor helps it get away with a lot. Sure, you'd probably prefer it if a furry paw didn't knock everything off the table, but it's hard to stay mad at your adorable, curious little housemate. As close as you and your kitty are, there are a ton of common myths out there about cats that aren't true. Everyone has an opinion, and some people believe cats should be kept as their ancestors were, allowed to roam outside, kill small animals, and potentially die a horrible death. Keeping a cat indoors is cruel, they say. Well, they're wrong. According to feline behaviorist Jane Ehrlich, pet cats should 100% be kept inside. Indoor cats aren't at risk of being hit by a car, being snatched by a predator, getting trapped somewhere, or being exposed to something that will make them sick. They're also going to be more well-adjusted, psychologically speaking, because they're not always on edge and looking for danger around every corner. As long as indoor cats have access to toys, cat trees, places they can climb and hide, and a safe, interactive environment, they'll live not just long lives, but happy ones. If you've come home to an empty food dish and a yowling cat, you know you're only good for one thing: opening the cat food. But a study from Oregon State University tried to find out what cats prefer most in their lives. According to Science Direct, they took two groups of cats, pet cats and cats from shelters, and presented them with options of food, socializing with a human, or playing with a toy. By the end of the tests, they found the majority of cats would opt for attention from the human even over some tasty food. Toys and scent stimuli didn't even stand a chance, and while there were differences between individual cats, there wasn't a statistical difference between the pet cats and the shelter cats. Consider this next time your cat gets mouthy when you come home. He may just be mad you were gone so long. Talk to a cat person and they'll insist cats are smarter. Talk to a dog person and it's canine brilliance that'll be touted. Both are wrong, and here's why. The first part of the answer is simply that we don't know how smart cats are because, well, they're cats. One of the world's foremost experts in animal cognition laughed when Slate asked him if he'd worked with cats. It was easier to work with fish, he said. Cats are just programmed differently. They described dogs as being tuned to a single frequency or channel all the time, while cats are channel surfers. Not smarter, not dumber, just different in a way we don't understand yet. According to the BBC, researchers from Kyoto University took some major steps in deciphering cat thoughts in 2017. When they tested cats, dogs, and their capacity for memory, they found both animals performed equally well. If you've ever left work in the morning and come home to find your cat in the exact same spot, you'd probably see that as proof cats are lazy. They're not. While it's true they appear to be sleeping for as much as 16 hours a day, cat behavior associates say they usually aren't really sleeping. Most of the snooze time is spent in a sort of doze, where all the senses are still alert and listening for prey, predators, or the crinkle-crinkle of a treat bag. They're not exactly on high alert, but could still respond quickly if something interesting happens nearby. According to Vet Street, there's a biological reason little mittens need so much downtime: diet. Cats are meat eaters, and long periods of rest or near rest help their digestive systems handle all that protein. Researchers have been trying to unlock the secrets of cat communication for a long time, but not surprisingly, cats don't like to cooperate. According to the BBC, it's only fairly recently they learned where the purr originates. a neural oscillator tucked away in the depths of the cat brain. One feline psychology researcher found that different cats purr differently under different circumstances. Sure, they purr when they're happy and content, but they also purr when they're alone or with other cats. Other cat psychologists suggest it's not an involuntary reaction, but a type of communication that starts when they're kittens. Purring helps them tell mom they're hungry, and that probably has something to do with why many purr when their human parents feed them. There are a ton of theories about the different kinds of cat purrs, including a nifty one about a purr that resonates at the same frequency bones heal. The theory is that when kitty curls up with someone who has a headache or injury and starts purring away, they might be trying to help.
So you think you know comics? Even if you can cite every issue where Swamp Thing defeats Batman or where Superman performs surgery with his heat vision, there's still a good chance that some popular but incorrect DC Comics legends have slipped into your comic knowledge without you even knowing it. There are a ton of erroneous assumptions about our favorite DC heroes and villains that everyone seems to believe. Here are a few of the most misleading myths about the DC universe. Batman never kills. A major part of Batman's characterization is his one rule. He never kills anyone, mostly as an extreme reaction to the murder of his parents. It's formed the core of some of the best Batman stories ever written. However, comics show us that this rule is more of a loose guideline, really. In some of Batman's earliest adventures, he was known to let people burn alive and even punch folks into acid. It's easy to write those off as exceptions from before the Batman character was really set in stone. Go back far enough, and Batman had no problem using guns either. But Batman has actually killed, and attempted to kill in modern times too. In 1988's Batman number 420, Batman fights the unfortunately named KG Beast to a standstill. Realizing he can't beat or capture him, Batman locks him in the sewers in a room sealed by a reinforced steel door and just leaves the villain to rot. The story was so unusual that a few years later, another comic added to the event by saying that Batman called the cops instead of just leaving the bad guy to die. If that's not bad enough, Frank Miller's All-Star Batman and Robin featured a Batman who set a bunch of thugs on fire and then got it on with Black Canary right in front of their burning bodies. Keep it classy, Bruce. Joker and Harley are in love. Fans of comics' most destructive power couple like to refer to the classic Paul Dini Batman story Mad Love as evidence that Harley Quinn and the Joker are a perfect match. The marketing for Suicide Squad didn't help, emphasizing romantic shots of the two from the movie. So what's the problem? Joker simply doesn't love Harley. He's actually an abusive manipulator. Mad Love and most Harley Quinn comics regularly emphasize that Harley was in love with a man who alternated between ignoring her and abusing her. It turns out that while Joker may not love Harley, Warner Brothers certainly does. Or at least they love the chance to sell countless shirts to teenagers who don't know the whole story. And they call Joker crazy. Aquaman is useless. He can talk to fish, he can swim pretty well, and he can talk to fish. Is there anything else to Aquaman?
My ability to talk with fish is of no help, Wonder Woman.
Most people never really read comics about Aquaman unless he happens to be appearing alongside the Justice League. Compared to demigods who can punch you through time and space, the ability to tell fish what to do seems less than impressive. Except Aquaman can actually do a whole lot more. In fact, he's pretty much a legit badass. First off, fish telepathy is cooler than you might think since he can weaponize the creatures found across 3/4 of the planet. If it lives in the sea, Aquaman will have it chomping down on you, no problem. Sometimes he can even use his fishy telepathy on anyone who evolved from aquatic life, which is literally everybody. His skin is strong enough to resist knives and machine guns, he can swim at 175 miles per hour, and he can see in nearly total darkness. While it's true he gets weaker if he's out of water long enough, Aquaman can naturally do most of what Batman needs billions of dollars in gadgets to do. If that means Aquaman has to spend a little more time in the pool, it's a fair price to pay. Green Lanterns are vulnerable to yellow. It's a weird weakness, but Green Lantern used to get his tush kicked by anything yellow. Yes, anything yellow.
How about this? Does the yellow hurt your eyes, my friend? Getting weak. Oh, so very weak. That's the Green Lantern.
Casual comics fans may assume that the character still suffers from this weakness, but because of comics' strangest retcon, Lanterns are pretty much safe against all parts of the spectrum. Back during the death of Superman's story arc, the alien Mongol and cyborg Superman completely destroy Coast City, the hometown of Green Lantern Hal Jordan. Hal goes crazy, kills a bunch of other Green Lanterns, and becomes a supervillain named Parallax. What does this have to do with a weakness to yellow? Sit tight, we're getting to it. 10 years later, Parallax was revealed to be an intelligent cosmic force that embodied fear, once imprisoned inside the Lantern's big power battery. So having a yellow fear god inside the source of the Green Lantern's power is what once made them vulnerable to yellow. Once the Green Lantern Corps and their battery were rebuilt, they were only vulnerable to yellow when they let themselves feel fear. Veteran Green Lanterns can now shield themselves against yellow simply by thinking brave thoughts. Well, at least until you get to Green Lantern's appearance in All-Star Batman. But that doesn't really count. Mr. Freeze was always a tragic figure. There is possibly no sadder villain in comics than Mr. Freeze. His most high-profile appearance came in Batman the Animated Series, where most fans learned the story of the scientist, Victor Freeze, who tries to preserve his dying wife in cryogenic stasis until she can be cured of her disease. Once Freeze's experiment is shut down by his uncaring superiors, Freeze is accidentally transformed into an icy villain who needs to stay in a special suit to keep his body cold. But none of that has anything to do with Freeze's comic origins, where he was first known as Mr. Zero, a mad scientist with a freeze ray who didn't show up until issue number 121, where his icy condition is immediately cured by steam. He also appeared in the 1960s Batman TV series where he was called Mr. Freeze for the first time, but he was still a generic villain that was played mostly for laughs. His name wasn't even Victor Freeze, it was Dr. Shivel. Critics and fans alike responded so well to the major changes that first appeared in his animated origin that it became his official story in the comics, video games, cartoons, and even in his introduction to the Gotham TV show. But nothing will be better than his big screen debut, right?
What killed the dinosaurs? The Ice Age!
Okay, maybe not.
To say Venom is popular is putting it mildly. After debuting as the new costume for Spider-Man, the symbiotic alien we'd come to know as Venom quickly became one of the most beloved members of Spider-Man's extensive gallery of foes. But here are some things you might have gotten wrong about Venom. Eddie Brock, the one and only? Venom made his, or maybe their, debut in 1988. The villain was a synthesis of two characters brought together to form the ultimate Spider-Man villain. One half was the alien symbiote that had formerly served as the web-slinger's costume before Peter Parker realized that his new pants had a mind of their own. The other was disgraced journalist Eddie Brock, who also nurtured an intense hatred for Spider-Man. In the years since, Brock has been synonymous with Venom, but if you're under the impression that he was the only villain to use that name, you're very mistaken. While Brock was the original and current Venom, he's far from the only one. In 2004, when he found religion after seeing The Passion of the Christ, no, really, Brock auctioned off the symbiote costume to a new host. It was originally purchased for $100 million by Angelo Fortunato, the teenage son of a mob boss who wanted to impress his father and become famous enough that girls would write fan fiction about him. Unfortunately for Angelo, his tenure as Venom only lasted a single issue, but the symbiote stuck around. Next, it bonded to Mac Gargan, the spider foe previously known as Scorpion, who even used it to become the fake Spider-Man on Norman Osborn's team of Dark Avengers. After that, it was confiscated by the government and given to Peter Parker's former high school bully and decorated war hero Flash Thompson. With it, he became a one-man commando unit called Agent Venom. Eventually, though, it made its way back to Brock permanently. Well, for now. First things first, Eddie Brock was the original Venom, but before he bonded with the alien symbiote, its first victim host was Spider-Man. He was absolutely, totally the first Marvel superhero to bond with a black costume, right? Well, yes and no. If you're talking about our real-world timeline, then yes, that's exactly right. If you want to dive into the actual canon of the Marvel Universe, though, things are a little more complicated. It turns out that the first hero to wear the alien costume was Deadpool? It's pretty weird considering that Deadpool made his first comic book appearance a few years after the costume debuted, but in 2015's Deadpool's Secret Wars, it was revealed that he actually tagged along with the rest of the heroes to the Beyonders live-action toy box. During the conflict, he was the first one to try on the symbiote, thinking it was a new set of clothes, but removed it after realizing it was alive, and he couldn't subject it to the pain of bonding with his own twisted thoughts. Secret Origins. Speaking of Secret Wars, it's obvious that the black costume that would become Venom was created just for the event. After all, every Marvel comic saw huge changes for characters that had gone off to Battleworld, and for Spider-Man, it was a new costume that was clearly created for the crossover story, except that it wasn't. Instead, the origins of the black costume come 2 years before Secret Wars, when a fan named Randy Schueller wrote Marvel with an idea for a story where Spider-Man would get a new black costume. In his idea, the new costume would be a high-tech update created by Mr. Fantastic. Jim Shooter, editor-in-chief of Marvel, liked the idea enough to pay Schueller $220 for it. But the proposed story never happened. Instead, Marvel kept Schuler's idea on the back burner until they found a place to use it. The only difference is that the suit had originally been pitched as being black with a red logo, and early designs released to promote the crossover show that the suit was originally intended to have Schuler's suggested color scheme, before it was changed to black and white for the final version. A love-hate relationship. One thing that can't be disputed about the Venom symbiote is that it has a deep and all-consuming hatred for Spider-Man. What other emotion could lead it to battle him so many times over the years? Could it be love? Let's just say it's complicated. Rather than just wanting to keep feeding on him as a host, the symbiote seemed to have a sort of affection for Spidey, and even risked its own life to rescue Peter after he rejected the alien costume. It's made even more explicit in Amazing Spider-Man number 317. In a battle that went way past subtext, Peter was able to defeat Venom by, no joke, stripping down to his underwear on the beach and offering up his body to the alien costume while shouting things like, "You want me? Then take me, I'm yours." It worked, too. Rather than sticking with its rebound, the symbiote fell for Spidey's Sim Booty call and knocked itself out trying to sever its connection to its current host. Who knew Venom was a villain who could be defeated by a "you up?" text? Best frenemies. Whether motivated by love or hate, Venom is decidedly an enemy for Spider-Man, except when he's not. While he originally was introduced as an antagonist for the web-slinger, his overwhelming popularity with fans led to a slightly different path. Aside from his original handful of appearances, the majority of Venom's most prominent moments involved him as a good guy, more or less. One of the biggest Spider-Man stories of the 90s, Maximum Carnage, saw Spider-Man and Venom teaming up to stop a bunch of villains led by a genocidal maniac bonded with a second symbiote named Carnage. Even more recently, the two characters teamed up again, and this time it was far from an uneasy alliance. Instead, when Norman Osborn bonded with a Carnage symbiote to become the Red Goblin and threatened to murder Spider-Man's entire supporting cast, Eddie Brock even went as far as loaning the symbiote costume to Peter Parker in order to give him the edge he needed to win the fight. That's a level of trust between them that goes well beyond the simple dynamic of archenemies. I want to eat your brains. One of the long-running jokes about Venom is that he eats brains, a fact so ridiculous that, well, actually this one's completely true. Venom really does eat brains. It's just probably not for the reason you think. In 1996's Venom the Hunger, Eddie Brock found that the regular food he was eating tasted like sewage and decided instead to make good on his threat to snack on a few crooks' brains. He was understandably horrified once he came to his senses, but the whole brain-eating thing wasn't just a shocking bit of cannibalism. Instead, it turned out to be a necessary craving for a chemical that existed inside the human brain. Fortunately, Eddie was able to control these cravings when he discovered that that same chemical existed in chocolate. Here's the best part though, that's not just goofy comic book science. The chemical phenethylamine is a 100% real neurotransmitter found in both the central nervous system and in chocolate. It's a good reason to keep a Snickers on hand, just in case you run into any evil parasites out there.
So many snacks, so little time.
The future is unwritten. But that doesn't stop doomsday predictions from coming fast and furious. Throughout history, humans have believed some pretty strange things about what the future held, and many times, false forecasters have been left scrambling for excuses when their predictions go wrong. It's hard to believe anyone would come up with some of these false facts about the future that never came true, so let's laugh at them. The end of an era. As far as human history is concerned, computers are pretty new, and considering how new they are, a pretty large portion of humanity relies on them for everything from banking to finding sexy singles in their area. Unfortunately, all of these exciting young computers weren't programmed with the turn of the century in mind. So in 1999, people were unsure what to expect when midnight approached on December 31st. At the time, computers processed the year using only the last two digits, so the year 2000 would be represented as 00. To a computer, that would look a lot like the year 1900. Many believe this would cause computers to crash, major networks to fail, and create blackouts all over the world, effectively putting an end to the technology era. Heck, even Spock was convinced.
Elevators may stop. Heat may vanish. Airplanes and trains may come to a halt.
Understandably, these predictions caused a major freakout. The government spent billions to rectify this problem, and insurance companies began selling Y2K plans, which hopefully weren't backed up on their ill-fated computers. People built bunkers and bought canned goods like it was the 50s. And then, nothing happened. In fact, it wasn't until the year 2010 that a similar date bug temporarily took down millions of PS3s. Now that actually sounds serious. Camping out for the apocalypse. Well-known Christian radio broadcaster Harold Camping lured listeners into his show by doing what any upstanding radio personality would do when they're desperate for ratings. He predicted the end of the world.
May 21 is the day of judgment. It is a terrible day of destruction all over the world.
Believers were told that on May 21st, 2011, Jesus would rise for the rapture, taking those who deserved to be saved up to heaven, while the rest of us were left to suffer 5 months of plagues and at least one more Smash Mouth album. Camping came to his conclusion by taking the estimated date Jesus was crucified and using a bunch of nonsense math that means literally nothing.
Add the number of people at the Last Supper minus the number of Filipinos in the Bible, and you get
3,100,000.
Until he came up with a date. Either that, or he just chose it because it was Judge Reinhold's birthday. Camping was able to spread the word quickly, and many believers sold all of their belongings in preparation for the rapture. And then it didn't happen. Camping blamed a few mathematical errors and postponed Doomsday until October, when it didn't happen a second time.
You're really pathetic, you know. I wasted all my money, and I sent it to you, and I don't have nothing.
Believers were clearly left broke and emotionally destroyed. Camping kind of apologized, but shut his mouth for the remaining 2 years of his life. Cosmic alignment. Astrologer/astronomer Johannes Stoffler was basically the Harold Camping of 1500s Germany, but with more of a focus on the zodiac than Jesus. Stoffler predicted that the world would end on February 20th, 1524, after the alignment of the planets under Pisces would lead to floods so great they would destroy the world. As a respected chair at a well-known university, Stoffler's prediction was trusted far and wide. Pamphlets were handed out, and believers built themselves wooden arks, hoping to survive the floods. Strangely enough, a thunderstorm struck that day, convincing the doubters that Stoffler's theory was coming true, even though, since we're all here right now, we all know it didn't. Those who hadn't prepared for the flood attempted to swim to the arks, and many ended up drowning. So thanks a lot, Johannes, you tool. In the dark. Life magazine made some pretty ominous predictions in their late January 1970 issue. Notably, air pollution was supposed to have cut the amount of sunlight reaching Earth in half by 1985. While the article didn't go into much detail about the actual science behind the prediction, it was written that scientists totally had solid evidence to back it up. Just like that weird kid totally has a girlfriend in Canada, or totally has a jet ski in his garage that you're not allowed to see. Life also explored other potential environmental catastrophes, like the idea that sonic booms from airplanes were going to constantly mutilate unborn babies. Needless to say, none of that happened. The article was ultimately published as part of an awareness campaign for the first Earth Day, and even if their numbers were just a bit off, we can all agree on one thing.
Let's save our environment, that we may be free.
Right. The rise of Atlantis. In 1980, retired psychology professor Charles Louis Spiegel, who you may want to know was going by the name Antares by that time, predicted that the long-lost city of Atlantis would rise from the sea in 2001. The Caribbean islands would be destroyed in the ensuing flooding. But don't worry, it gets better. Spiegel also predicted that soon after Atlantis rose, a group of aliens called Maitan would land on Earth in spaceships made of crystalline gold to enlighten the human race. Which doesn't actually sound so bad at this point. The Unarius Academy of Science, which has very little to do with, actual science, run by the fashionable Queen Uriel, even bought land for the ships to touch down on.
These ships, starships, will land, and they have been built to all interconnect, like this model you see behind me.
They'd land with 33,000 passengers from around the universe, combine Voltron style into a giant school, and exist forever. And of course, none of that happened. Unfortunately, it seems the Maitans took one look at humanity and turned their space car around before we even got to meet them.
Yeah, and when they're adults, they just celebrate with lots and lots of alcohol.
They know their atmosphere is disintegrating, and the humans choose to focus on that.
Fake news may be getting its moment in the spotlight, but it's hardly a new phenomenon. In fact, people have been mistakenly believing total nonsense since the dawn of human civilization. And sometimes, those mistakes actually end up changing the world. Here's a look at some false facts that changed history. The immortality elixir. Once upon a time, people believed alchemists could create magical potions that could do just about anything, including grant immortality. So in the year 850, a Chinese alchemist finally came up with what he thought was the perfect formula: 75 parts saltpeter, 15 parts charcoal, and 10 parts sulfur. A contemporary text recorded the results, saying, "Smoke and flames result," so that the alchemist's hands and faces had been burnt, and even the whole house where they were working burned down. That's because, in arguably the greatest irony of all time, instead of inventing an immortality potion, the alchemist had accidentally created gunpowder, which would lead to centuries of warfare and genocide around the globe. Whoops. Phlogiston. Back in the day, people believed that things burned because they contained a substance called phlogiston. Things that burn easily had a lot of phlogiston, and when it was gone, burning stopped. Plus, when the air absorbed too much of the substance, it became phlogisticated and wouldn't allow anything else to burn. That theory stood for about a century, but in the 1770s, French scientist Antoine Lavoisier decided to try and prove once and for all that phlogiston was nonsense. To do so, he performed a series of experiments, leading to the first descriptions of oxygen, and eventually to the creation of an entire new field of modern science we now know as chemistry. So, thanks, phlogiston. The evil eye. Nowadays, we know that your eyes work by receiving light, which is converted by photoreceptors into electrical impulses interpreted by your brain. But thousands of years ago in ancient Greece, scientists thought eyes worked not by receiving light, but rather by sending out invisible beams of fire. Not only is this wrong, it also contributed to one of the most widespread superstitions in the world, the evil eye. Cultures and religions across the globe have come up with all sorts of wards and charms against the power of the evil eye, but the most effective is simply the scientific knowledge that eyes don't really work like that. Unless, of course, you're in the X-Men. What? Lysenkoism. In 1936, Trofim Lysenko presented the bizarre theory of Lysenkoism to the Conference of the Lenin Academy in Moscow. This theory essentially claimed that plants would adhere to communist principles. Rather than traits being inherited through genetics, they could be trained by the people. It was nurture over nature, only with beets and potatoes. Soviet farmers were taught one plant would sacrifice itself for the good of its neighbors, that plants chose their reproductive partners, and that plants would eventually just get used to those cold Russian winters and start growing better. As propaganda, it was great. As agriculture, it was a colossal disaster. According to the Smithsonian, it kicked off decades of food shortages, famines, and crop failures. It also destroyed the science of agriculture itself within the Soviet Union, as those who argued against Lysenkoism were sent to prison, executed, or simply just disappeared. Lysenko essentially told Soviet leaders what they wanted to hear and stopped science for decades, at the cost of untold lives. El Dorado. The stories of a city of gold hidden somewhere deep in the South American jungle started sometime after 1521, when Spanish explorer Cortez danced across the water and looted the Aztec Empire. Everybody wanted in on the action, and the legend of El Dorado was born. Of course, no such city actually exists, but thousands of European looters swarmed over the Western world trying to find it, destroying entire civilizations and enslaving a continent in an effort to get to El Dorado's fat booty. Ironically, historians now believe the Spanish actually found the basis for the El Dorado myths when they conquered the Muisca people in 1537. But the conquistadors didn't realize it and kept on pillaging and looting for centuries in search of a non-existent dreamland. The only good thing that came of it? Thanks to their pointless search for a non-existent city, European explorers ended up mapping almost all of South America. Just like Google, only with way more massacres. The evil Emperor Palpatine may be back for the rise of Skywalker, but there's still a lot we don't know about this mysterious Dark Lord of the Sith. Here are a few of the commonly held misconceptions about the Emperor and his origins. When you think of Emperor Palpatine, you probably think of Scottish actor Ian McDiarmid. After all, McDiarmid has played the Emperor for almost all of his major appearances. He's the man behind the makeup during Palpatine's first major appearance in Return of the Jedi. He plays the conniving Chancellor in all 3 of George Lucas's prequels, He provided Palpatine's voice for the Emperor's cameos in Star Wars Rebels, and he's coming back to play the mysteriously resurrected despot in The Rise of Skywalker 2. But McDiarmid wasn't actually the first person to portray Palpatine on screen. For the Emperor's first brief appearance in The Empire Strikes Back, Palpatine was originally brought to life by one man, two women, and a wild animal. Actress Marjorie Eaton provided the Emperor's face for the final movie, while makeup artist Rick Baker tested Eaton's prosthetics on his wife, Elaine. Clive Revell, an accomplished actor and a friend of Empire director Irvin Kershner, provided his voice. Palpatine's eerie yellow eyes, meanwhile, weren't human at all. They belonged to a chimp and were superimposed over Eaton's during post-production. George Lucas replaced the Eaton-Revell-Ape hybrid with new footage featuring McDiarmid for the 2004 DVD release of The Empire Strikes Back. But a few other actors took on the role of Palpatine after that, too. In the early sessions of the Clone Wars animated series, actor Ian Abercrombie voiced Palpatine. After Abercrombie passed away, the role was taken over by Tim Curry, who you might best known as being the guy who did this.
I see you shiver with anticipation.
The Emperor has always been part of the Star Wars story. After all, it's kind of hard to have an empire without one. But the Emperor wasn't always Palpatine, and he wasn't always the series' main villain either. In George Lucas's earliest first draft of Star Wars, the Emperor was a man named Kaz Dashit, who is described in the script as being a thin, gray-looking man with an evil mustache which hangs limply over his insipid lip. Dashit wasn't Force-sensitive. He wasn't that scary either, and Darth Vader spent a good deal of the movie plotting to undermine his authority. By the time the final movie rolled around, the Emperor was known as Palpatine, but he still wasn't the Palpatine that you know today. In Alan Dean Foster's official Star Wars novelization, Palpatine is depicted as a recluse who disappeared from public view long ago, and who was quickly manipulated and controlled by his own Imperial underlings. Like all the other Star Wars film novelizations, Foster's book was considered in continuity right up until the point other canon materials explicitly contradicted it. That means that, until The Empire Strikes Back was released, Emperor Palpatine wasn't really the villain of the story. Instead, the Imperial governors and bureaucrats who used the Emperor for their own ambitions were the real villains. That includes figures like Grand Moff Tarkin, who oversaw the Death Star's construction, and Darth Vader himself. Compared to them, Palpatine was just an afterthought. In the original Star Wars trilogy, the chief villain was just known as the Emperor. Later, however, supplementary materials such as novels, role-playing games, and screenplays showed that his last name was Palpatine. The prequel trilogy went further still and revealed that he was from the planet Naboo, and that he's known among the Sith as Darth Sidious. But so far, Emperor Palpatine's first name has yet to be spoken on screen. That doesn't mean he doesn't have one, of course. It just took a long time for fans to learn it. In 2014, several decades after the Emperor's big screen debut, Del Rey Books published Tarkin, one of the very first novels in the new Disney-approved Star Wars canon. While the book's plot centers on the rise of Wilf Tarkin, a former Clone Wars soldier who rose through the Imperial ranks to become the Empire's very first Grand Moff, it does contain one crucial piece of trivia for Palpatine fans. The former Chancellor's first name is Sheev. Okay, yes, that sounds kinda silly, but most of Naboo's citizens have names that appear to be derived from Sanskrit, so Sheev fits, and with good reason. George Lucas himself came up with it. As Tarkin author James Luceno explains, Lucas shared the name while working on Underworld, Lucasfilm's ill-fated attempt at a live-action Star Wars television show. Lucasfilm's story group gave the name to Luceno, and he put it in Tarkin. Given how Palpatine looks, you might think that he's pretty ancient, especially since his master was Darth Plagueis the Wise, you know, the Sith who mastered the secret of eternal life. But apparently, that's not the case at all. According to the company's old official timeline, Palpatine was born a mere 82 years before the first Death Star was destroyed in the Battle of Yavin, making him only 86 when Darth Vader killed him. Much of the information from when that timeline was published is no longer canon, but allusions in Disney-approved material such as the novel Tarkin imply that Palpatine's age hasn't changed much, if at all, in this brand new era. So, ugly? Yes. Old? Not so much. As it turns out, that was very good news for Ian McDiarmid. McDiarmid was only 37 when he played Palpatine in Return of the Jedi, but his age didn't matter then because he was wearing makeup. By the time The Phantom Menace rolled around, during which Palpatine is supposed to look pretty normal, McDiarmid and his villainous alter ego were about the same age. Revenge of the Sith goes out of its way to explain why Palpatine appears as a normal middle-aged man in the prequels, but looks like a monster in the original Star Wars trilogy. During Palpatine's fight with Mace Windu, the Jedi Master uses his lightsaber to reflect Palpatine's Force lightning back on him. When the lightning hits Palpatine's face, he transforms into the Emperor everyone knows and hates. Problem solved, right? Except that's not how Force lightning works. Luke wasn't scarred when the Emperor hit him with Force lightning in Return of the Jedi. Neither was Anakin when Count Dooku zapped him in Attack of the Clones, or Kylo Ren when he was hit by Supreme Leader Snoke. In the Star Wars Insider issue 82, Ian McDiarmid explains that Palpatine's evil visage is actually what he always looked like, and that his more human appearance was just a facade. With Palpatine dropping his pretenses and revealing himself as a Sith Lord, he decides that there's no reason to hide his true face either. That's not the gospel, though. Matt Martin, a member of Lucasfilm's story group, has his own theory. Palpatine was exerting so much power to deflect the lightning that the dark side itself warped his looks. Various reference books have similar explanations, but there's no clear canonical explanation for the discrepancy. Most masters teach their apprentices, obviously, right? That's literally the point of having an apprentice in the first place, but not Palpatine. Although Darth Sidious might have offered training to Darth Maul and Darth Vader with Count Dooku, he took a bit of a shortcut. See, unlike Maul or Anakin, Dooku was already a full-fledged Jedi when Palpatine got his hooks in him. During a scene deleted from Attack of the Clones, it is revealed that Dooku had renounced his Jedi vows in favor of returning to the wealth and power afforded to him by his heritage.
I never understood why he quit.
Well, one might say he was always a bit out of step with the decisions of the Council.
Rumors suggested that Dooku was actually planning to found his own Jedi Order, but fate had other plans. When Darth Maul died at Obi-Wan Kenobi's hands, Palpatine needed a replacement, and he needed one fast. Dooku, who had already mastered the Force and proved that he was sympathetic to the dark side, was right there for the taking. The complete story has yet to be revealed, but Palpatine recruited Dooku, named him Darth Tyrannus, and nabbed himself a ready-made henchman without any fuss. If only it were always that easy. Disney and Lucasfilm have been open and frank about the fact that their sequel trilogy wasn't planned out in advance. A couple of weeks before The Force Awakens premiered, Lucasfilm president Kathleen Kennedy told Variety that they hadn't mapped out every single detail of the next two films, while Rian Johnson wasn't given much direction as to where to take The Last Jedi's plot during the writing process. All in all, it appears that Disney and Lucasfilm have been making it all up as they go along. Palpatine seems to be the one big exception. While it'd be easy to dismiss the Emperor's upcoming appearance in The Rise of Skywalker as a last-minute ploy to shock audiences, it's apparently been in the works for a while. At Star Wars Celebration 2019 in Chicago, Kathleen Kennedy told Yahoo that Palpatine's return had been in the works for a long time. She explained, "We had not landed on exactly how we might do that, but it was always going to be part of Episode 9. That's all well and good, but that's also not exactly how it went down. Original Star Wars Episode 9 director Colin Trevorrow revealed that his version did not feature the Emperor at all. Bringing back the Emperor was an idea JJ brought to the table when he came on board. It's honestly something I never considered. I commend him for it. This was a tough story to unlock, and he found the key. The moral of the story is Palpatine is back, whether you wanted him or not, and the universe is a lot less safer with him around."
Tina Turner's celebrated songs and at times turbulent personal life have found a place in pop culture. So have a number of myths about the singer. Here are some of the false things you believe about Tina Turner. While stage names are not uncommon in music, Tina Turner has been such a staple in the industry that many people have come to believe her name is actually Tina Turner. However, Tina Turner was born Anna Mae Bullock to Floyd and Zelma Bullock on November 26, 1939. Her parents separated in the early 1950s, and young Anna Mae moved in with her grandmother in Nutbush, Tennessee. At 16 years old, she moved to St. Louis, Missouri. In 1956, she met her future husband, Ike Turner, who at the time was the guitarist and band leader of the group Kings of Rhythm. Ike took an interest in Anna Mae, and soon the teenager was performing as the lead singer in Ike's band. Originally, Anna Mae went by Little Ann in her first days with the group. However, Ike convinced Anna Mae to change her stage name to Tina, which she did. With the name change, the band's name went from the Kings of Rhythm to the Ike and Tina Turner Revue. Ike remained the band leader and commanding voice in the group, while Tina became the frontwoman and lead singer. During this time, the two began their romantic relationship. Ike and Tina Turner would go on to marry in 1962. According to the second disc, Phil Spector put so much work and energy in his song with Tina Turner, River Deep Mountain High, that upon its commercial failure in the United States, he left the music industry for the rest of the 1960s. After all that effort, one might think that the two remained close, though this was not the case. By 2007, Spector had gone from one of the most important producers in pop music during the 20th century to standing trial and eventually being convicted for the murder of actress Lana Clarkson. That same year, Spector spoke out against Tina Turner following the funeral of Ike Turner. Spector slammed Tina's 1986 autobiography, I, Tina, which told of her abusive marriage to Ike Turner, saying, "I have an ambivalence towards Oprah Winfrey. She made Tina Turner's book into a bestseller which demonized and vilified Ike. The book wouldn't have sold 10 books. It was badly written. It was a piece of trash." Much like Ike, Phil Spector's ex-wife, singer Ronnie Spector, accused him of being abusive throughout their marriage and professional relationship. Tina Turner's 1984 comeback album, Private Dancer, was the end of a long journey almost a decade in the making. The album featured some of the biggest names in music contributing to it, such as Mark Knopfler, Jeff Beck, and David Bowie. While many believe that Private Dancer was Turner's first solo work, all music indicates that the album was her fifth as a solo artist. Surprisingly, Tina, who came from a blues soul background and who became known by the honorific the Queen of Rock and Roll, gave her take on a different genre in her solo debut. Tina Turns the Country On was released in 1974 and saw her give her own spin on country music. The album did also feature the R&B and pop rock sound that Turner was accustomed to singing with her husband. Turner's second solo album, 1975's Acid Queen, was titled after her character in the 1975 film Tommy, based on the rock opera from The Who. Despite being filled with covers, the album was seen as a solid foundation for a future solo career. Tommy also featured the couple's last hit song, Baby Get It On. Her next two solo efforts, Love Explosion and Rough, were both released in 1978, the same year she divorced Ike. Neither received the same commercial success as her first two solo works, and they would be Turner's last studio albums until Private Dancer. Tina Turner and Aretha Franklin have many similarities. The two broke into stardom around the same time in the early 1960s. Both had long, successful careers long after people had counted them out when they hit their 40s, and both are seen as powerful black female voices in the music industry. Another point of comparison is that, like Aretha Franklin's Respect, Tina Turner's Proud Mary, arguably her most well-known song, is a cover that she made her own. While Otis Redding's original version of Respect did not garner him much attention on the pop charts, Creedence Clearwater Revival's Proud Mary was a hit. It was actually a bigger hit than Ike and Tina's version. CCR's original version peaked at number 2 on Billboard's Hot 100 charts in March 1969, while Ike and Tina's version peaked at number 4 in March 1971. While CCR's version is a classic rock song in a basic C to A chord structure, Ike and Tina's version begins slowly as she states that the band is going to start, quote, nice and easy, but finish nice and rough. After the first verse, the song explodes into a soulful anthem about a hard-working woman keeping her head high. While CCR won the chart battle back in the day, the song is firmly remembered as Tina's own, to the point that people forget that John Fogerty wrote and sang the original. Abusive relationships can take a great amount of support and care for the victim to recover from, and even then, this may not be enough. Despite Tina Turner becoming an international solo star and achieving far greater fame than Ike during their marriage, the octogenarian queen of rock and roll is still dealing with the effects of the abuse she suffered from him.
It was very difficult and dangerous because Ike was a violent person.
As Bustle reports, following her divorce from Ike and her resurgence as a successful solo artist, many people believe Turner had moved on. However, as she has expressed to documentarians Dan Lindsay and TJ Martin, this was not the case. Tina told Lindsay and Martin, "People can't imagine the kind of man he was." In their 2021 HBO documentary about the famed singer, Lindsay spoke about why he believed Tina wanted to sit down and tell her story once again, stating, "We realized that the motivation on Tina's side was that she was having trouble getting the record industry to disassociate her from Ike. Ike and Tina, for better or worse, were one of the most iconic musical duos and musical couples of the second half of the 20th century. This means despite her solo career and telling the truth about their relationship, Tina will always have trouble disconnecting from her ex-husband." According to Ultimate Classic Rock, Tina Turner and Mick Jagger first met each other in 1966 when Ike and Tina toured England with the Rolling Stones.
What's it like standing with Mick Jagger? Are you kidding? I mean, you are talking about legend.
The two crossed paths over the ensuing years, and at Live Aid 1985, the pair performed 2 songs together. Their steamy stage act included Jagger removing his shirt and ripping off Turner's skirt mid-performance. However, as Turner explained, the pair were just colleagues. Tina described Jagger and fellow British superstar David Bowie as, quote, "the boys."
I thought she was great. Well, she is great. She is great.
According to Fabiosa, Turner had this to say about teaching Jagger dance moves while they toured together. "Mick wanted to dance, and I was a dancer, but he never gave me the credit. He said his mother taught him how to dance, but we worked with him in the dressing room, me and the girls, and we taught him how to pony." The Rolling Stones were enthusiasts of black music, with their first albums being filled with blues and R&B covers. The band's name comes from a popular song by blues legend Muddy Waters. When asked about Jagger and the other musicians from Great Britain admiring her work, Turner had this to say, "All those English guys felt I could sing. They felt there was something to learn from my singing. My vocals are natural. I hit the note naturally and they'd go, 'What? How'd you do that?'" Outside of her dynamic voice and long legs, Tina Turner's wigs are her most recognizable style.
I've been doing these wigs for all my life. I've always done my own.
From when she first stepped on stage in the 1950s until she stepped off more than a half a century later, Turner has rocked wigs like she has rocked concerts. However, as CBS News reports, these were originally less a style for Turner and more of a confidence enhancer. She told Gayle King in an interview for CBS Sunday Morning that she was very insecure when first starting her music career. Turner recalled, "I had this strange voice most girl singers didn't have. You know, in the beginning, I didn't. I thought it was kind of ugly because it didn't sound like Diana Ross. But then afterward, I thought, yeah, it sounds like the guys." Turner found solace in one area that put her above other performers. "I was the only one that danced, and I remember Little Richard said, 'Tina dances, you know? It's hard for us to compete with her.'" Still, this did not keep her from disliking her appearance and turning to wigs and makeup to hide her true face. When asked if she thought of herself as attractive, she responded, "I never thought I was. I tried to. That's why the wigs and the makeup and the dress. I had to really make myself pretty. I had to work on that." Many divorces end with both sides obtaining an equal share of money and possessions. This way, both parties leave on equal terms and are able to continue on with their lives. Tina and Ike Turner's divorce was less a 50-50 split and more of a 90-10 split, to put it generously, in Ike's favor. The end came after Tina and her husband had an altercation in Dallas. As she put it, the 1978 divorce left her walking away with, quote, 36 cents in a gas station credit card. As Ike had taken the royalties from their almost 2 decades of work, Tina had to lick her wounds and retreat in order to plan out her future away from her ex. At first, she had to take menial jobs in order to feed her children, cleaning houses and living on food stamps while working as a musician. Turner continued performing at low-profile venues and making guest appearances on other artists' albums until her big break in 1983. That was the year that Turner's cover of Al Green's Let's Stay Together netted the singer a huge hit. The next year, she released Private Dancer. The album sold more than 20 million copies and put Tina Turner back in the limelight. Despite detailed accounts of his abuse of Tina and a popular biopic putting an image to these stories, Ike Turner continued to work as a successful musician until his death. As Ebony explained in their tribute piece following his passing, Ike was not simply one half of the Ike and Tina Revue. He was one of the most important figures in 20th century music. At the age of 19, Ike's band recorded the song Rocket 88, which became a hit and helped spark the genre of rock and roll. Little Richard said his song Good Golly Miss Molly was inspired by Rocket 88. As a talent scout, Ike discovered Little Walter, Howlin' Wolf, and Muddy Waters, and he also worked on the early recordings of B.B. King. According to biography, throughout the 1980s, Ike's drug use increased as Tina's star rose. The decade ended with allegations of abuse from his ex-wife and an 18-month prison sentence for drug use. He was in prison when the Ike and Tina Turner Revue was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. However, Ike's career rebounded post-prison. He recorded more albums and was nominated for 2 Grammys, winning 1 during the 2000s. Ike Turner's personal demons ultimately led to his death in December 2007, when he succumbed to a cocaine overdose at 76 years old.
Chewbacca is more than just Han Solo's sidekick. An outstanding warrior, pilot, engineer, and friend, the Big Wookiee is incredibly popular, but it turns out most fans don't know all that much about him. Keep watching as we address some of the most common misperceptions about Chewbacca. The Star Wars Holiday Special is a crucial and hilarious piece of Star Wars lore. Filmed in 1978, the Holiday Special reunites the film's main cast in a musical adventure that featured the debut of Chewbacca's Wookiee family, his wife Mala, son Lampuwaru, called Lumpy for short, and his father, Atichakuk, who is nicknamed Itchy. Even the biggest Star Wars fans agree that the Holiday Special is phenomenally bad. So at Lucas' behest, the special only aired once and was never released on home video. Mala and Lumpy did make their way into the old expanded universe, but Disney threw all that material into the garbage compactor when it bought the franchise in 2012. You would think that would mean that Chewie's family is gone from continuity for good, but you'd be wrong. While Mala and Lumpy don't play major roles in the current Star Wars canon, they've been mentioned in the young adult novelization of A New Hope, The Princess, the Scoundrel, and the Farm Boy by Alexandra Bracken, and in Chuck Wendig's Aftermath trilogy, which explains what happened after Return of the Jedi. Itchy also got a mention in Solo, a Star Wars story, but unless you speak the Wookiee language of Shiriwook, you probably missed it. It wasn't until the junior novelization of the film that most people realized that Atichakuk had returned to the canon. Believe it or not, Chewbacca didn't spring fully formed from George Lucas's imagination. While the very first Star Wars draft did indeed contain a character named Chewbacca, described as an 8-foot bush baby with fierce baboon-like fangs, Chewie didn't take on his final form until much, much later, and not until Lucas took a big cue from the work of another high-profile fantasy author. Famous concept designer Ralph McQuarrie, who is responsible for some of Star Wars' most iconic designs, went through a number of different takes on Chewbacca, but none of those pictures were quite right. At some point during production, Lucas handed McQuarrie a drawing of a furry, bow-wielding creature created by noted sci-fi artist John Schoenherr for a 1975 novelette by George R.R. Martin, who would later go on to write Game of Thrones. The similarities between Schoenherr's illustration and McQuarrie's subsequent designs are striking, making it pretty clear where McQuarrie's influences lie. Chewie's appearance isn't the only thing Lucas borrowed either. The word Wookiee was actually invented by a voice actor on Lucas's previous sci-fi film, THX 1138, while improvising some dialogue in the recording booth. As the late, great Peter Mayhew told the story, you might think he was the one and only actor considered for the role of Chewbacca. According to Mayhew, who stood 7 feet 2 inches tall before passing away in 2015, all he had to do during his audition was stand up.
I stand up. George goes, and virtually turned to Gary and said, I think we found him.
But according to actor David Prowse, Mayhew wasn't the first person Lucas asked to play Chewbacca. Lucas was impressed with Prowse's small but imposing role in A Clockwork Orange, and when they met, he said he wanted to cast Prowse in one of 2 roles in Star Wars. He offered Chewbacca first.
I said, well, what's Chewbacca? And so it's like a hairy type gorilla that goes through the film on the side of the goodies. And I thought, well, I don't fancy that very much, George. And I said, what's the other one?
That role turned out to be Darth Vader, which Prowse immediately accepted, and Peter Mayhew was offered the role of Chewbacca instead. Mayhew went on to turn Chewbacca into one of the most beloved sidekicks of all time, while Darth Vader became one of the most feared villains in cinematic history. In all of his big-screen appearances since A New Hope, Chewbacca's signature weapon has always been his crossbow-like bowcaster. Unlike his brothers and sisters in arms, however, Chewie hasn't been using the exact same weapon all this time. According to the reference book Ultimate Star Wars, Chewbacca actually crafts new bowcasters regularly, although he does seem fairly fond of his most recent design, which combines the traditional Wookiee engineering with the power pack of a Stormtrooper blaster. That explains why the bowcaster bolts change between red and green in various pieces of Star Wars media, and also helps clarify a confusing moment in The Force Awakens. In the film, Han Solo acts like he's never held a bowcaster before, even though he's been palling around with Chewbacca for over 40 years.
Can I try that? I like this thing.
However, knowing that Chewbacca frequently swaps his weapons out, it makes sense that Han just hasn't used that specific bowcaster before, even if he has used others. Before Disney bought Lucasfilm and decided to explore the post-Return of the Jedi timeline on the big screen, a series of novels and comic books explained what happened to Luke, Leia, Han, and Chewbacca after the Empire fell. And it turns out poor old Chewie didn't fare very well. In Vector Prime, a novel written by popular fantasy author R.A. Salvatore, an alien race called the Yuuzhan Vong invades a galaxy far, far away and makes a planet crash into its own moon. Unfortunately, Chewbacca is on that planet, and he doesn't survive the attack. As you can imagine, Chewbacca fans were upset, and they let Salvatore know, flooding his email account with complaints and even sending death threats to his publisher Del Rey Books. But it turns out they were targeting the wrong guy. While Salvatore wrote Vector Prime, the decision to kill Chewie off was part of a 20-plus book outline that Del Rey, Lucasfilm, and some previous Star Wars writers made before Salvatore was hired for the project. Years later, Randy Stradley, a comic book writer and editor for Dark Horse Comics, took credit for Chewbacca's murder. It's all moot now, of course. In the updated Disney canon, Chewbacca lives on, even if his friends aren't quite so lucky.
Everyone loves Pixar. The studio has been enchanting audiences worldwide with clever, original, emotional storytelling ever since that cute little desk lamp first hopped across our screens. But even the most die-hard fans might not know that some of the seemingly obvious Pixar facts floating around are straight-up lies. Pizza Planet gets around. Pixar has mastered the art of the Easter egg. Subtle references and nods to previous films have become their bread and butter, and there's one thing in particular eagle-eyed viewers have come to expect every time around: the Pizza Planet truck from Toy Story, which appears in nearly every Pixar flick. While the truck played a key role in the Toy Story series, all other appearances have amounted to blink-and-you'll-miss-it cameos. But despite what many claim, it's nowhere to be seen in 2004's The Incredibles. Speaking to Huffington Post about it in 2015, director Brad Bird said it really wasn't on his mind at the time, and he had no idea whether a cheeky animator had managed to sneak it in. No one has found it yet, but it does, however, definitely make it into the video game. The theory of everything. The Pixar theory is the suggestion that each movie takes place in the same fictional universe and falls somewhere into a convoluted and meticulously constructed timeline. Gaining lots of traction after blogger John Negroni laid it out in 2013, the theory includes such bonkers claims as Boo from Monsters, Inc. being the same character as the Witch in Brave, and the Cars from Cars living in a near-future Earth after all humans have left. It's not like Pixar hasn't been stoking the proverbial flames from the beginning, dropping in subtle references to other films all over each new release. Naturally, the internet has run with it. When asked about it at a 2015 press conference in the Philippines, Pixar CCO Pete Docter popped that balloon with one swift pinch.
I think of them as very different universes, and that they don't cross over.
And there you have it. It doesn't get much clearer than that.
Aw, man!
Racing to the bank. A lot of people assume the Cars movies did gangbusters at the box office. But as Wired's rundown of the studio's box office earnings over the years indicates, all three Cars movies are actually on the lower end of the Pixar scale in terms of earnings. The perceived success of Cars is almost entirely rooted in its merchandising dominance. The franchise has amassed over $10 billion in merchandising revenue, according to the BBC, which is around 30 times the first film's total box office gross. Cars 2 had a much bigger budget than the first, and its box office gross was only marginally higher. And it was the first Pixar film to receive mostly negative reviews, making it a critical flop if nothing else. Then there's poor old Cars 3. It was actually greeted with a respectable critical response compared to its predecessors, and the consensus is that it boasts a lot more substance than either of the other two movies, but the numbers didn't reflect any of that. So the next time that one die-hard Cars fanatic in your group of friends goes off about all the dough the flicks raked in, remember, they're full of it.
I gotta admit, you tricked us real good. And we don't like being tricked.
WALL-E's agenda. 2008's WALL-E tells the story of a trash-compacting robot who rolls around a barren, garbage-covered Earth, while obese humans idly reside in a perpetually floating orbital space station called the Axiom. The blatant environmentalist and anti-consumerist themes here aren't exactly buried, and they got a lot of attention, both negative and positive, on the film's release.
Too much garbage in your face? There's plenty of space out in space!
The only problem? Director Andrew Stanton says he had no agenda in the first place. In an interview with Coming Soon, the filmmaker admitted, "I don't have an ecological bone in my body." The motivation behind depicting a desolate trash planet was purely functional and aesthetic, a means of providing an easily and instantly understandable situation for his main character. There's a bunch of trash, no one else is around to pick it up, and so WALL-E's purpose in this world is clear. Likewise, Stanton says the depiction of obese humans in the space station wasn't so much a critique of corporatism, overconsumption, or greed, as it was merely a representation of what happens to the body when it's been in space for a long time. Can't flop, won't flop. In short, Pixar movies are gold mines. Toy Story rocketed to the top as the highest-grossing film of 1995, and 23 years later, The Incredibles 2 became the highest-grossing animated film of all time in North America, according to Forbes. It's widely assumed that the studio simply can't release a financially unsuccessful film. Well, they actually already have. Twice. Remember The Good Dinosaur? No? There's a reason for that. Plagued by production woes, numerous delays, and a tepid critical response, it was Pixar's first proper commercial flop. And it was more or less shoved aside and forgotten like the black sheep of the family, a minor bump in the road. But then Cars 3 fared almost as poorly in 2017. Pixar's name wasn't enough to get butts in the seat and ensure box office glory, clearly, and financial success was no longer a guarantee. Cinematic starts. When Pixar first started making waves in the 80s with a string of technically astounding short films, from the outside it looked like the studio had emerged almost fully formed from the chrysalis, dressed to the nines and ready to party. But before staking their claim as the most commercially and artistically fruitful film studio of its day, the company existed in a much more modest form. In fact, it'd be a few years before they could even call themselves a movie studio. Before Pixar was Pixar, the company was known as the graphics group of Lucasfilm's computer division. They developed computer technology to enhance other people's movies from 1979 to 1986. They were responsible for the Genesis effect sequence in Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, for one. John Lasseter joined in 1984 as interface designer, and then came along some guy named Steve Jobs, recently outed from Apple, who bought the company for $5 million in 1986 and christened it Pixar. It was still primarily a hardware company around this time, and folks were honing their craft working on short films, commercials, and TV spots before Disney came a-knocking in 1991. They struck a deal to make and distribute at least one computer-generated animated movie together. Infinity and Beyond was waiting just around the corner.
To infinity and beyond!